Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Eloise and I'm from the Big Apple, otherwise known as New York, where I grew up in a glamorous apartment block that overlooked the bustling, very busy city that was so alive with activity and hundreds of yellow taxicabs. I once heard someone say that if you're tired of London, you're tired of life, and I always felt the very same way about New York. There was so much going on in this exciting, vibrant, buzzing metropolis, and I found watching the throng crowds of people my greatest source of fascination. And there were indeed times walking down the sidewalk when returning home from school with my satchel flung over my shoulders that I would see two people caught up in an altercation or brawl with much arguing and fighting going on, and very soon a little crowd would gather around to watch the drama unfold, as people are always enamoured by real-life soap operas. I remember on one occasion a young woman was literally giving birth on the sidewalk, and I'm not exaggerating. I mean, how does that happen? But here in New York we've pretty much seen it all, and there's not much that surprises us anymore. It would seem that the baby was coming, and nothing was stopping it. The local residents ran around getting towels, and before the ambulance arrived, the woman had given birth to a little boy, and everyone was so ecstatic, and there was much applauding and clapping, and the proud mother was beaming from ear to ear. "I'll call him York," she told us, because he was born on the street. And everybody applauded, thinking that this was the greatest idea in the entire world. I just love New York, as there was so much about this fabulous city to truly appreciate. I marvelled at the cheerful street vendors selling their cooked food, and the smells of sizzling, delectable chicken kebabs that would permeate and waft through the air, titillating your taste buds with the aromatic aromas. Then there are all the interesting shops, the delicate essences, with their vast arrays of baked delicious breads and sliced meats on display. And let's not forget the beautiful parks in New York, where you can enjoy a solitary walk on your own in nature and eat your sandwiches under a large oak tree while you watch the world go by. During the summer months, there are bodies literally sprawled and strewn over the lawns of the parks like lizards lapping up and soaking up the sunshine, which is a sight to behold. My story begins when one day my parents informed me that they were going on a 3-week business trip to Switzerland and that I would have to go and stay with my grandparents on their West Virginian farm where my mother had grown up as a young girl. The last time I'd actually ever seen my grandparents was 5 long years ago when I was about 7 years old, so my memories of them were vague, foggy and somewhat cloudy. "But I don't want to go," I protested, stamping my foot like an insolent spoilt brat. "If I can't come to Switzerland with you, I want to stay here in New York. I don't want to go to the country to stay with strange people that I barely know." Of course, my indignant, belligerent and acrimonious protests were ignored by my parents, who simply refused to put up with my sulking, juvenile behaviour. And eventually I surrendered rather disagreeably to my fate, for I had no choice in the matter, as I was going to stay with my grandparents come what may. Before long I found myself sitting in a taxicab being ferried from Charleston Yeager Airport to my grandparents' farm. I remember the taxi drove past the most exquisite-looking countryside, full of verdant rolling hills, flowering meadows, statuesque mountains, pretty farmhouses, barns and fields filled with grazing cows or horses, and I was beguiled and bedazzled by these incredible, sensational, idyllic views. Finally, the taxi took a few turnings down some precipitous dirt roads, where the uneven rocky surfaces caused the taxi to wobble and jolt precariously, and you could hear pebbles beating against the undercarriage. Eventually the taxi approached an open wooden farm gate, with the sign Wild Blackberry Orchards, and it veered down this long, smooth white road through this luxurious green hilly countryside that was covered with bushy areas of ubiquitous trees and dotted with a couple of bright red barns. There were also horses grazing on a hilly fenced elevation, swishing their tails and glancing up in our direction briefly. In a trice the taxi driver had parked his cab and reversed in an open courtyard in front of a very impressive, rather imposing-looking 1800s farmhouse that looked like it had stepped out of the history books into our reality, and I have to admit it was as pretty as a picture. All of a sudden the front door burst open, and a plump woman wearing an apron around her middle with short curly grey hair and a big beam on her face came bustling down the steps towards me, enveloping me in her arms and covering me with hundreds of kisses. "Oh, it's so good to see you, Eloise! My, you've grown! You remind me of your mother when you were her age. Oh, the likeness is quite uncanny. Do you remember me? I'm your grandmother." I shook my head. I was too small, I said. "Never mind," she said. "It was an awfully long time ago." I couldn't help but smile, as I wasn't used to receiving such an enthusiastic, rapturous welcome. I couldn't help but warm to this agreeable, good-natured and amiable woman, who I realised was my grandmother. It was not long before I met my cheerless grandfather, but his reception towards me was frosty, haughty, indifferent, and very aloof. My grandmother might as well have been telling him that he was having cheese on his baked potato instead of chili, as his dispassion towards me was literally mind-blowing. I mean, I was his granddaughter, for goodness sake, who he hadn't seen in many, many years, but my presence was of very little appeal or interest to him. My grandmother did her very best to try and introduce me to the surly, crotchety and prickly man, whom I decided at once that I didn't like. I noticed his head was buried beneath the large newspapers he was reading, and he looked up with annoyance and studied me for a moment through his hard, piercing, mean eyes. I promise you I felt like a bird being examined by the beady eyes of a sparrow hawk, as that was how menacing and uncongenial his presence was towards me. "This is Eloise," said my grandmother. "She'll be staying with us for 3 weeks now. Isn't it nice to have a young girl running around the farm? Much like old times, when Margaret was a young girl. You remember?" "How could I forget? So this is Margaret's daughter," said the old man, with a very disapproving look. "The likeness is quite remarkable. You better behave yourself, little girl," he said, waving his finger at me warningly, as though reprimanding me for bad behaviour I had yet to commit. "I'll be watching you, and if you step out of line, you will be in very big trouble. I can't abide silly little girls." "I'm not a little girl," I protested, "and my name is Eloise, and I'm 12 years old, so I'm not little." My grandfather looked up at me from behind the newspaper, rather surprised to see that I'd stood up for myself. It was very clear to me that he wasn't used to such a spirited individual like myself, who wasn't afraid to fight back, and I could see that he was ever so slightly impressed by my sudden outburst, but was certainly not willing to show it. "You're quite a feisty little girl, aren't you?" he said. "Dreadful shame you weren't born a girl. What a dreadful waste." At that my grandmother promptly whisked me out of the living room. "Don't mind your grandfather," she whispered to me. "He's a miserable, cantankerous, grumpy old man, but if you keep out of his way, he shouldn't give you any problems." From that point on, I firmly decided to stay out of my grandfather's way, as I didn't like this horrible, condescending man who clearly loathed children, most especially girls. In fact, as far as girls were concerned, he didn't have time for them at all. I briefly recall my mother describing her father as a very authoritarian, belligerent type of parent who was rigidly disciplined and made her life a living hell growing up. I couldn't understand why such a nice, lovely lady like my grandmother had put up with such a vindictive, nasty man, who certainly, as far as I was concerned, lacked manners and was insolent and rude. From that point on, I decided that one of the best ways to try and avoid him was to keep myself entertained in the great outdoors, so I climbed on the back of a mountain bike and began cycling all over the emerald green countryside. I realised to my amazement that I was actually enjoying myself considerably, with the gentle wind blowing against my long brown hair, and the evocative smell of freshly cut straw permeating the air. I parked my bicycle and eagerly ventured into the woodland area, which was exceedingly steep, as it was on a mountainous elevation, and I began to climb up this rocky terrain until it seemed to level out and flatten over a vast area on top of the mountain, where you could observe exquisite views over many miles of the glorious pretty valley below. I was mesmerised by the beauty of the tall statuesque maple and chestnut trees, along with the shorter trees covered in white blossoms that I was to learn later were service berries. All these trees seemed to stretch out their branches from a great height, providing an arched canopy above my head, and the subtle shafts of sunlight that permeated through the branches dappled the forest floor in an ethereal luminescence that was as magical as it was enchanting. The forest floor was elegantly decked out with impressive-looking voluptuous boulders that were like great works of contemporary art that any modern art gallery would be proud to showcase, because these natural sculptures had been worn away over a vast period of time, using the weather as its masterful chisel. If that wasn't alluring enough for you, there were soft mosses, wild gingers, woodruff and lacy ferns carpeting the ground. A delightful silvery stream meandered through this whimsical fairy tale-like woodland expanse, and it burbled and bubbled as it travelled over the rocks and branches, and its pleasing sound intermingled with the bird's song, and was exceedingly therapeutic. I sat down on a smooth rocky ledge and just listened to the sounds of the forest. All of a sudden I noticed that the bird's song dissipated and began to fade, and everything suddenly became deathly quiet, so incredibly still, in fact, that you could have heard a pin drop. I became painfully aware that I was certainly not alone, as I could sense that foreboding feeling that something or someone was watching me. But who? I couldn't imagine. It was an unsettling, very airy feeling that sent cold chills travelling down my spine and made me feel this very urgent need to leave the forest at once. I have suffered from a neurological disorder called narcolepsy pretty much all my life, which is a condition which can cause me all of a sudden to just fall into a deep sleep, and this can happen in any situation and during any activity, which is why I wear a bracelet around my wrist to explain my condition. I have refused to allow my narcolepsy to rob me of my freedom, although I have fallen asleep in strange places before. I woke up once in a Walmart store, where I'd fallen asleep over a display of baked beans, and was found lying fast asleep, surrounded by a sea of tins, and the distressed customers thought I was dead, and I caused a huge frenzy in that store. Another time I woke up in a dentist's waiting room, having fallen fast asleep over the man sitting next to me. That was more than a little embarrassing, as I woke up to see his concerned face staring down at me, and his wife looking far from amused. I'm one of the lucky people with this condition, because I can go for days at a time without an episode, as I do know of people who can have 5 attacks a day. Unfortunately, when I'm bathing or showering, I have to be watched carefully and supervised, which can, of course, be very awkward, as I do like my privacy and loathe being watched. I think in that moment I must have had a narcoleptic episode, because all of a sudden I woke to find myself being vigorously shaken and jolted on the chest by these massive hands, by what I can only describe as this colossal humanoid being covered in hair staring down at me with deep-set, dark, earnest eyes that looked very distressed and discomposed. The creature smelt woody, like a damp tree trunk. I think the creature that had attempted to resuscitate me obviously thought that I must be dead. I'm one of those people that can look as if I'm dead and be rather unresponsive when I have a narcoleptic episode, as the extreme from being wide awake to falling asleep can be so dramatic that you may have the false, misleading impression that I've dropped down dead in front of you. So over the years I've scared quite a lot of people with these strange episodes of mine. On this particular occasion I sat bolt upright, rubbing my eyes vigorously to ensure that I wasn't dreaming. I was sure that I must be, as I could hardly believe what I was witnessing. This incongruous creature who had been hovering over me stood up straight, towering at a very intimidating 8 foot tall, and glided away to sit next to another small-looking creature on a large boulder, yards away from where I had fallen asleep. Both of these outlandish creatures studied me with animated, curious, interested eyes, and on seeing that I was very much alive, they began to whoop with delight. I truly think they thought I had miraculously returned from the dead. The only way I can describe these anomalous creatures to you is like gigantic ape-like humanoids covered with long flowing dark brown hair with pretty auburn hues or highlights, overlong arms, and rather peculiar looking cone-shaped heads, but with human faces, leathery dark skins, furrowed brows, deep-set eyes, and flat noses. I was not quite sure how to react to them, for although I was overawed and daunted by their imposing, intimidating presences, they obviously had just tried to help rescue me. I was too shocked and bewildered to feel any powerful emotion driven by fear or terror. The large female creature exuded a matriarch's protective, caring energy, and she was watching me intently, appearing to be in no particular hurry to leave my side, as I sensed she was still worried about me. I heard her communicating with the smaller creature in a strange, rather peculiar language that sounded rather like Chinese, and the tone of her voice was stern and authoritative, and I could tell she commanded great respect. Instinctively I knew she was telling the younger male, who I imagine was her son, to keep a careful eye on me. Moments later she returned with a large hollowed piece of bark that was full of berries, which she handed to me, and after I ate the delicious sweet fruit, the creatures both began to whoop. I think the act of eating on my part had confirmed to them that I was going to be fine, and it warmed the cockles of my hearts that these unusual creatures genuinely seemed to care about me. The next thing I knew was that I could hear my grandfather's booming voice thundering through the woods, and he sounded less than amused. "Little girl, are you up there?" He called this, not even bothering to address me by my name. In that moment I panicked, and I was so terrified that my heart began to beat like a heavy drum, and the creatures, on sensing my obvious distress, immediately took a precautionary stance, and instead of running away from the approaching human, they retreated behind some trees, standing very still, and remaining wearily watchful over me, like invisible protective bodyguards. All of a sudden my grandfather ambled ungraciously towards me with an awkward limp in one of his legs, and carrying a hunting rifle in his hand, and he was wearing an enraged look upon his face. He lifted up his rifle, pointing it directly at me and shouting, "I knew you would get up to all kinds of mischief the moment you got here. You're just like your mother," he sniped bitterly. "The two of you are like peas in a pod. She was always up to no good as a little girl. It seems like the apple does not fall far from the tree. What on earth are you doing hanging around in these woods when you have that dangerous sleeping condition? You're asking for trouble." "It's called narcolepsy," I piped. "Don't try and be clever with me, young girl. You know what I'm talking about. It's not safe for you to go wandering around the woods. If you could fall asleep in any second, you could fall into a stream and drown, or end up ravaged by a wild animal while asleep. Anything could happen to you in the woods. You're a very silly, stupid little girl." "Like you care," I piped. "You're right. I don't care a jot, but your grandmother clearly does, and she instructed you not to wander off too far from the house, which is why I'm here on her account. You need to get back to that farmhouse immediately and play there in the backyard so your grandmother can keep her eyes on you. She will never forgive herself if something bad were to happen to you." "Nothing bad is going to happen to me," I chided. "I know how to look after myself." "You're a very disagreeable little kid, aren't you? It seems that your mother has failed to teach you any manners. On my watch you will do as you're told. Do you understand, young girl?" If I had my way with you, you'd have a good flogging with a leather belt to knock some sense into that little head of yours." My grandmother noticed a movement suddenly from the large female creature, who was watching everything from between the branches of a tree, and was bopping her head to the left and to the right. All of a sudden my grandfather's wrinkled face grew very grave, and he immediately reached for his rifle and began to aim it at the creature with his fingers pressing down upon the trigger. "No!" I screamed. "No! You can't do that!" Without thinking, boldly and possibly foolishly on my part, I ran quickly forwards, pushing my grandfather out of the way so that he wouldn't harm the hairy ape-like humanoids, and his bullets ricocheted, firing far away from both the creatures. But my grandfather himself went tumbling backwards down the hilly embankment, rolling down some jagged rocks, when he finally came to a complete stop. I quickly ran towards him, horrified to see that he wasn't moving, and his eyes looked glazed over. His mouth was opened, and he was completely unresponsive, and I realized that he most certainly was dead, and I could see blood pooling beneath his head. It was terrifying. I tried to shake my grandfather wide awake. "Wake up!" I cried. "Wake up!" But he was unresponsive. I began to scramble down the steep embankment, almost sliding down the rugged mountainous path in my desperate haste, and then finally, when I arrived on terra firma, I hightailed it towards the farmhouse like a bat out of hell. My heart was pounding violently in my chest at 1,000 miles an hour, and I was breathing very heavily. I bolted through the front door, springing into the kitchen, where my grandmother was standing at the stove stirring a thick custard with a wooden spoon. For a moment she stopped, looked at me in surprise, and then became alarmed. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked. "You look very dishevelled and out of breath. What on earth is going on? You've grown as white as a sheet." I looked at my grandmother through misty eyes that were clouded by my salty tears. "I've just killed Grandpa," I told her. "I'm a murderer." And at that I burst into tears. "Of course you're not a murderer," said my grandmother, taking me into her arms, trying to reassure me. "I'm sure whatever's happened, it was just an unfortunate accident. Now you take me to your grandfather." To cut a long story short, my grandfather was pronounced dead, and the whole tragic death was deemed as an accidental event, even when I told the police what had actually happened, against my grandmother's advice. But they assured me it was just a tragic accident, of which I was clearly not responsible. I was amazed how kind they were towards me, and even the coroner's report classified my grandfather's death as accidental. I didn't tell anyone about the strange hairy humanoids I'd encountered in the woods that I was trying to protect. I realize all these years later the two creatures were definitely Bigfoot. I won't forget the compassion that those creatures showed me when they thought I was dead. I could never have allowed my grandfather to kill those beautiful creatures that were so human, as ethically, in my opinion, that would be grievously wrong, unless, of course, the creatures were a dangerous threat, which they clearly weren't. A day later, my mother cut her trip short from Switzerland and arrived with her suitcase at my grandmother's farm, and the two of them embraced and sobbed in each other's arms for what seemed like ages, leaving me feeling wholly responsible for what had actually happened, and so I wished with all my heart that I could turn back time and undo this dreadful event. "I'm so sorry to make you both so unhappy," I cried. "I really didn't mean to push grandfather over. It was an accident." "You mustn't blame yourself, sweetheart. We're not crying because we're sad. We're crying because we're so happy, because that monster is finally dead. Your grandmother and I have longed for this day, but we never believed it would happen, because it's always the good ones that tend to die first." All of a sudden I began to learn about my grandfather and what a dark, treacherous individual he had been for over 55 years of marriage, and how he was a misogynist that had despised and loathed women. My grandmother had taken care of him all his life, and he had regularly flogged her with a leather belt, and sometimes even locked her up in a dark hall cupboard for a couple of days without food or water. When my mother was born, he continued to beat my grandmother up, but although he never physically assaulted my mother, he looked upon her like a lower form of pond life, and bitterly complained about how unfortunate it was that she hadn't been born a boy. He made my poor mother feel that she was never good enough. It was hardly a wonder that I hadn't a relationship with my grandparents, as my mother had been shielding me from my grandfather all of my life, and my grandmother had missed out on getting to know me over the years. But more recently my grandfather had developed heart problems and was in poor health, and was less nimble on his feet, which was why for the first time ever my grandmother had deemed it safe enough for me to come and stay on her farm. Now I was the one that had contributed to his untimely death, but it would seem that there were not many in the small rural town that were sorry about his departing from the earth plane, and I think at his funeral it was more like a celebration party, as everyone in attendance was happy that he was gone, and in some way my grandfather had impacted on so many lives in such a negative way, as there was not a person at his funeral gathering that actually had a nice thing to say about the man. I was to discover that my grandmother knew all about the wild men in the woods, and she had claimed that they had lived on our farm for generations, but it would seem my grandfather had wanted them all dead, simply because they had pilferaged a few of his vegetables and fruits from our yard, which I thought was ridiculous. "Thieves!" he had screamed, "the whole lot of them, treacherous thieves! I want these wild men off our property now, and if I get my hands on them, they're all dead." "I think they knew he wanted them all dead," laughed my grandmother, "because he would spend so much time searching for them and trying to catch them and kill them. They would tease him by throwing rocks at him, and then he would fire in the direction of the rocks, and he could hear them whooping with delight, as they thought it was a hilarious game, and were clearly laughing at him. But your grandfather was never amused, and the more they toyed with him, the more determined he was to kill them, and it became like an obsession for him." "Did he ever manage to shoot one of those creatures?" I asked in alarm. "Of course not," my grandmother chuckled, "because they were way too fast for him." She continued, "One day when it was snowing, I could see large footsteps in the snow leading to the chicken coop, and I realized the wild people had pinched a couple of my chickens, and I knew if your grandfather found out about it, he would have a tantrum. I discerned that they were clearly hungry, so I left a large box filled with food at the edge of the woods every week during the winter months without your grandfather knowing about it. He would have been furious if he had. A wild woman would pick up the parcel and nod at me as if to say thanks, and when she ventured into the woods, I kid you not, you would hear a chorus of delighted whoops, and that would thrill me. I remember thinking that those creatures showed more gratitude for my food parcels than your grandfather ever did over a single meal I ever cooked him. All these years later, I look back on these events with nostalgia and realized how privileged I was to encounter the creature that we like to call Bigfoot, and my experience with these hairy, elusive beings was a very positive one. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, when it comes to buying a property or a piece of land, let me assure you that if the price tag is too good to be true, then it probably is. You need to pay attention because nothing ever comes cheap without a very good reason, and there is usually a catch as to why you're buying it for a song. I was to discover this when at the age of 50 I decided to sell up my sizable farm in West Virginia and downsize to a smaller farm in Kentucky, which would be easier to manage now that my children had long since left home and flown the nest to start families all of their own. When I asked the estate agent why the farm was going so cheap, she was really rather evasive and non-committal, and just informed me that the previous owners wanted a quick sale. My wife sensed immediately that something was up, as she's always been intuitive and doesn't suffer fools gladly. "There's something not right," she said. "Didn't you think the estate agent was rather ambiguous and prevaricating? I sense there's something she's not telling us. Did you not notice how she started brushing us off when we asked her awkward questions about the previous owners? I think she's hiding something nefarious from us. I really do." "Don't be ridiculous, sweetheart," I had said. "The estate agent was just being very brisk, businesslike and efficient. You're just used to people being over-friendly, that's all. She probably didn't want to ramble on, as she has houses to sell and business to conduct." "No," insisted my wife. "That woman was very definitely shifty, and she was indefinite. Why would someone sell up after having recently finished the renovations to their colonial farmhouse and then sell the place for a reasonable price? None of it makes any sense. Don't you think we should go for a drink at a local bar in the town and find out what the locals have to say about the place before we do something stupid like placing an offer on the farm, as irresistible as it may seem to you?"
"Very well," I said. "If it's going to make you feel better about buying the place, why not? We haven't got anything to lose, after all."
Sid Plowman, who ran the local bar in the town, was very friendly towards us, and was a likeable, amiable and jolly kind of character in his early 60s, with a long bushy white beard and a bright orange bandana that he wore over his head. He poured me a large draught of beer, and my wife had a vodka, lime and lemonade, which she sipped very elegantly.
"You folk are not from around here, are you?" he said, looking up at us with a bright, friendly smile. "Are you passing through?"
"Well, we are not officially," I said.
"We are thinking of putting an offer in at the Hickory Homestead Farm. You don't happen to know it by any chance?"
"As it happens, I do," said Sid.
"An excellent piece of land, with some rich, fertile soil that has successfully produced a thriving harvest year after year, not to mention a very mature, established wooded area with some very old trees that have outlived all of us. It's a particularly attractive farm, especially after all those arduous renovations that brought that house up to speed. Not long ago, that colonial house was in an appalling, dilapidated state for many long years, and was quite literally neglected and falling apart at the seams. It was tragic, really, but poor Mrs. Spacey and her husband were always in debt, paying off excessive school fees for their children, as they insisted on sending their kids to the best private schools. And let's not kid, that set them back a bob or two, as raising kids ain't cheap, whatever way you look at it. So school uniforms and summer camps certainly took precedence over damage to the house, which took a back seat. Then fortune favoured Mrs. Spacey. She received a sizable inheritance from her father's deceased estate, so she injected a great deal of money into restoring the farmhouse back to its former glory. I do know they were planning to retire there, but I gather from my wife Pam that the house looks like $1 million these days, as it seems that no expense was spared, ensuring that the house's historic integrity was very definitely preserved." "That is very true," I said. "That's one of the reasons we are eager to buy the place, because it doesn't require any work at all. But you don't happen to know why it's going on the market so cheap, do you? It seems a ridiculously low price for such a desirable home."
"You mean you don't know?" asked Sid, raising a quizzical eyebrow.
"The estate agent didn't tell you about the house?"
"Tell us what?" asked my wife, growing concerned.
"Well, I don't know quite how to say this to you, but the house seems to be haunted," said Sid, looking awkward. "It seems to have been on the market for 3 long years, without a single buyer as a result. People here are very superstitious, you know, wary about purchasing a haunted home. It would seem that the renovations seem to have sparked and activated some paranormal activity." "I don't believe in hocus pocus," I piped. "It's nonsensical, all that stuff." "I must confess I didn't believe in it at all," said Sid, "until many of the builders working at that site complained that their tools would go missing, only to turn up later in rather peculiar places, and they said that something would occasionally tap them on the back when no one appeared to be there. And one man kept swearing that he could hear a woman's voice saying, 'Help me, please, help me,' and he said it freaked him out. I gather he refused to return to the job after that." "Is that it?" I said. "I hardly see that as a good reason for selling her land so speedily. I mean, someone asking for help and some tools going missing for a while, I hardly see as a very big deal, and I'm sure there's a rational, practical explanation for these anomalies, as there usually is an explanation in some way." "Well, there's more to it than that. but I'm afraid Mrs. Spacey was never ever forthcoming about it all. She was reticent by nature at the best of times, and so getting anything out of her was like extracting blood out of a stone. However, she did claim that something had pushed her down the staircase once with a brute, savage force, and that for her was the final straw, which was why the Spaceys put the place up for sale. After those astounding revelations from Sid, I cannot say that I lost any enthusiasm for buying the property, as all the gossip was hearsay as far as I was concerned. I also do happen to know, from having grown up in a small rural town myself, that rumours that circulate have a habit or propensity for becoming highly exaggerated. I remember once, for example, hearing that Mr. Brown, a man that lived in our small town, had been attacked by a vicious, savage cat, and by the time the story had reached our home, we were informed that this cat was a dangerous mountain lion that had scratched him to within an inch of his life, and it was a miracle that he was still alive. Upon seeing Mr. Brown, my mother had said to him, "Oh, I heard about your dreadful attack, Mr. Brown, and how badly beaten up and scratched you were by that dangerous, horrible cat. I'm so relieved you're all right." At that, Mr. Brown promptly responded, "Good grief, woman! The way you and all the townsfolk are talking, you would think I was attacked and mauled by a mountain lion. It was only my domestic tabby that scratched me, and vicious and mischievous he may be, but dangerous he most certainly is not. Why are all the townsfolk around here making such a monumental big deal about my cat scratching me? People have been sending me flowers, chocolates, and get-well-soon cards. Honestly, what's wrong with the folk around there?" At that, my mother was very appalled at how a disagreeable domestic cat had somehow managed to morph into a ferocious mountain lion. But that is the nature of gossip for you, that does have the remarkable predisposition of inflating everything, so that a small little party balloon blows up into a hot air balloon. There is quite a difference. Going back to the buying of the house, after much persuasion, my wife finally allowed me to buy the place on the strict condition that we had the place blessed by a priest, and she also saged the whole house in order to remove any negative energy. Before long, we settled into our beguiling colonial farmhouse, and we soon began to realise that all the rumours about the house were just that, rumours and idle speculation, for we never had any trouble from outer worldly sources, so to speak. Well, not in the beginning, that is. My greatest source of contention about my idyllic farmland was a growing monumental hog problem, as after sowing my seed, those annoying, irritating creatures would waste no time in sloughing up the land with about as much efficiency as a bulldozer, which meant I was forced to reseed it a couple of times and call out for government resources to begin trapping the tiresome buggers. But unfortunately, from what I learnt, they never cover the costs of the replaced seed. One day when I ventured into the statuesque woods on my land that were full of ancient oak trees, hickories and pines, and were so tall and imposing that I marvelled that they'd never been cut down, as they towered in the sky like sizable skyscrapers with magnificent vertical trunks, and they formed a perfect canopy above my head, allowing shafts of sunlight to dapple the floor in a resplendent subtle light. As I walked through the spectacular woodland, the enchanting, sharp, sweet, refreshing, minty smell of pine permeated through the air and reminded me of Christmas. I sensed something was different about the woods on this occasion, and the only way I can describe it to you is that I felt that I was definitely not alone, and that there was a very powerful presence in the vicinity, such of the likes that I have never ever experienced before. It was an intricate sense of knowing that I was standing close to a forceful apex predator, much like a lion, rhino or elephant, something very sizable and powerful that demanded my attention and respect. All of a sudden, a very large, healthy tree confirmed my very worst fears, as it came tumbling down with effortless ease, landing only yards away from where I was standing. I was so astounded, because a healthy tree does not mysteriously uproot itself out of the ground like this for no apparent reason. and there was no wind on this sunny spring day. I knew that something was hiding in plain sight, and whoever they were, I knew that they had performed this clever stunt to get my undivided attention. Who was it that was strong enough to push over a tree like this? I couldn't imagine. I just stood there gobsmacked and nonplussed by this extraordinary event, trying to make sense of it. Then quite suddenly another tree came tumbling down, again only yards away from me. Was I alarmed, and was I perplexed? Of course I was, but I was also intrigued and mystified as to who or what could be capable of this impressive manoeuvre. I refused to be intimidated by this strange, unorthodox phenomena, and stood my ground instead of running away, which I'm certain most people in my position would wisely have done, but that was not me. I've always had nerves of steel, and not easily been intimidated or disheartened, and in a strange way I sensed that I was being tested by something or someone, and come hell or high water, I was going to pass their duplicitous test. Seconds later a large stone came flying in my direction, once again narrowly missing me by inches, but I just knew that whoever was throwing this rock at me knew exactly what they were doing. If they really wanted to harm me, they could have done so already, as they knew how to aim with an accurate precision. That was very apparent to me. So I firmly stood my ground, simply refusing to budge. In seconds a couple more large rocks came flying towards me, and they were incredibly close, too close for comfort. They could have potentially knocked me out in a single blow, but they did not, so I remained steadfastly still. All of a sudden I heard a piercing, loud whistle that was so shrill, and too shrill to be of human origin, and it certainly was no bird. In a trice I saw what I perceived to be part of a tree trunk, only it wasn't, because it differentiated itself from the tree and disproportioned itself, rather like a butterfly emerging from a cocoon, and separating itself from the silk, making its distinction very clear. Once he had distanced himself from the tree as a different entity, that was when I observed him. He made his presence known to me, for without doubt he had chosen to show himself to me. It was not an accident that I was seeing him. I knew I'd passed his test because the creature looked rather impressed. He regarded me through his wise, very intelligent brown eyes. I sensed he was studying me curiously, as if reading my very thoughts. The creature was very large, imposing and sinewy, and was easily over 8 foot tall, 700 pounds, and 3 feet wide across the shoulders that were gargantuan in size. He looked exactly like a very strong, powerful, athletic human being, only much wider and much taller, covered in long, flowing brown hair. Only his muscular arms were particularly long, travelling below his knees, and his head was an unusual pyramid shape, while his weathered face was uncannily human in appearance, with dark tan-coloured leathery skin, a long beard, a sloped wrinkled forehead, a flat squashed-looking nose, with deep-set toffee-coloured eyes. This extraordinary creature then turned around and glided into the heart of the woods, and he moved on his powerful, very strong legs, with such agility and grace, as though he was floating. How can something that size move with such elegance and poise? It was absolutely mind-blowing. I remember thinking, what the heck was that? I didn't feel concerned or fearful, but just so overwhelmed with a sense of wondrous awe, as I'd never seen something so fantastical and incongruous with our reality, something that made me question everything I thought I knew. I discerned few people have ever seen a creature like this at such close range. For me personally, it was an incredible, provocative experience, like encountering a woolly mammoth or even a dinosaur, as that was how prodigious, portentous, and phenomenal this creature was, in my humble opinion. Later that afternoon the trapper arrived in his white van to set up all his traps to help manage our hog population, but no sooner had he arrived on the scene than he bolted out of the wood green with a terrified, discomposed face that was drained of all its colour. He was saying that something had been throwing rocks at him and had been stalking him stealthily through the woods like a prowling predator, watching his every move. Whatever it was, he said, it was monstrously huge, because I could hear it breathing, and it sounded like a horse, and I could feel its predatory eyes on me, he exclaimed. But I couldn't see it, and I don't want to either, thank you very much, as the less I know about what is loitering in your woods, the better as far as I'm concerned. He promptly informed us that he would send someone else to set up the traps, but as I expected, they never arrived. I was feeling very aggrieved about this monumental setback, because how was I going to grow any crops with an out-of-control hog problem on my hands that I could not manage on my own? These hogs successfully were sabotaging all my hard work. The next day I tried to take matters into my own hands by stealthily trying to creep up on some wary hogs with rifle in hand, but at the best of times I've never been skilled at hunting, as I lack the quintessential patience, skill and coordination clearly needed for an efficient kill. I could see the creatures were rooting around in the soil, causing an extensive amount of damage, but they smelt me before they even saw me, and immediately trotted away at one hell of a speed. I began to scream in frustration, placing my hands over my ears and feeling so infuriated and overwhelmed. Oh! Oh! All of a sudden, the body of a dead hog came flying in my direction like a ball suspended about 10 feet in the air, and it came thundering to the ground with an almighty crash after bouncing for a moment. I was astounded to see that a sizable 700-pound hog had been wilfully thrown into the air, as if it was light as a feather, when the reverse was actually true. I know of no man with the capability of performing such an outlandish manoeuvre that requires incredible strength. On close inspection of the hog, I discerned that it had been killed by 2 breaks to the neck. Over a couple of hours, several hogs were now lying dead on the edges of my pasture, all killed with exactly the same protocol. Over the next couple of days, many more were culled, of which I was incredibly grateful, but that was not through the help of government authorities, who had failed to be of much assistance to me. Instead, I knew I owed a debt of gratitude to this intelligent, discerning, idiosyncratic creature that I had observed in the wood-green. I believe it had generously assisted me in keeping the hog population under control, and had discerned that I was having huge issues with these creatures. At last I was able to sow the seed on my land without any issues. When I told my wife about what had happened, she was determined that we should leave a large basket of fruit out for the creature by way of a thank you, which was what we did. And in turn he rewarded us with a dead deer on our doorstep the following morning that had been killed by 2 breaks to the neck. So my wife filled up our freezer with venison. One day my wife told me that she was having peculiar, very lucid dreams, which was exceedingly uncommon for her, as she never usually remembers any of her dreams. I see this young African-American girl. She's standing at the end of my bed. She keeps asking me for help because she needs to go home to see her baby. I can see her face very clearly, and she looks discomposed and distraught, and I ask her why she can't go home, and then she points to this horrible oafish-looking man with mean, dark, piercing eyes and a scar around his cheek, who keeps running to the door and blocking her path. I can sense that she's trapped, and she begins to cry, and when she cries there's a puddle of water near the front door from all her tears. This was an extraordinary revelation on my wife's part, because we both knew that we'd been calling the plumber around to the house on several occasions because we were always finding large puddles of water near the front door. The plumber was exceedingly perplexed by this mysterious water and told us that there were no leaks anywhere in the roof, and nothing that could account for this mysterious water, but he said the water tasted salty, which was an even greater enigma for us. So my wife's peculiar dream certainly gave us pause for thought and reflection. "I think I'm going to call over a psychic medium to the house," she said. "I believe my lucid dreams are somehow connected to this place, and in some way I want to help set that poor African-American girl free if I can. I do feel strongly that she is tied to this place in some way." We contacted a highly credited psychic medium who agreed to visit our home on the Friday night. But it was strange how our house that had been devoid of paranormal activity up till now, well, so we thought, suddenly became a very different place. The only way I can actually describe it to you is that a very heavy, menacing and rather sinister presence became very tangible to us, and you could physically sense that someone was there in the room with you, only you couldn't see anything. During the night my wife had woken up screaming, insisting that she had seen a man's scowling face leering at her with very mean, dark, sinister eyes. But his body, she told me, seemed almost abstract, and then he just vanished before her eyes. The way he looked at me made my skin crawl. He was hideous, and I could feel his rage that seemed directed at me. It was like he wanted to kill me. I knew my wife was not predisposed to making up stories, and so I believed her. Imagine our surprise the very next morning when I went down to breakfast to discover that all our kitchen cabinets were wide open, and several dozen plates were lying on the ground, completely smashed to smithereens. "Who did this?" said my wife, looking appalled. As we were pondering this bizarre situation and cleaning up all the damage, the bell to our front door rang, and it was the psychic who was planning to visit us on the Friday evening, but had arrived 2 days earlier, and by the aggrieved expression upon her face, something was irking her considerably. "My name's Laura," she said, shaking my hand cordially. She was a nice, attractive-looking young woman with a warm smile, flawless fair skin, and brown bob chestnut hair with golden highlights, and very intense dark brown eyes. "I'm sorry to arrive here unannounced," she said, "but I sense that you are both in very grave danger. There is a dark force in this house that is trying to harm you both. I couldn't get to sleep last night, as I had dreadful visions of your wife being thrown down the stairs by this vindictive man whose intention is to break both your necks. This malevolent entity will stop at nothing to try and kill the both of you," she said, looking at us both gravely. "He'd like to gather your souls among those he has already imprisoned here. Even in my car on the way to your farmhouse, my brand new tyre was punctured deliberately in order to stop me from cleansing this house of yours and forcing him out of this place. Believe me, he does not want to leave." "But why would he want to harm us?" asked my wife. "Can I sit down for a moment so that I can tell you exactly what's going on?" said Laura. And so it was, over a hot cup of tea, Laura began to tell us the incredible story. She presented us with pictures she had drawn of the entities in our home. My wife nearly fell backwards on her chair when she saw a picture of an African-American girl that she recognised. "That's the girl I saw in my lucid dream," she exclaimed to me. "Who is she?" "Her name is Yolanda, and she was a slave in this house in 1810. And unfortunately the landowner, Mr. Cudmore, was having a secret relationship with her, and when he discovered she was pregnant, he killed her. He didn't want his wife to know about his adulterous affair. He has trapped her soul in this house, along with many other souls, including that of his own wife, and he is refusing to let them go to the light or cross over to the other side." "But why would he do such a dreadful thing?" asked my wife, appalled. "Because he's afraid of judgment, and also he seems to enjoy being a bully. I'm inclined to believe the latter is more the case. This is a picture of Mr. Cudmore that I've drawn," she said, handing the picture to my wife. My wife gasped in astonishment. "That's the face of the horrifying man I saw standing at the end of my bed last night. He looked furious. See, I told you, he had a nasty skull," she said, pointing to the picture. "He wasn't an attractive man, and I could feel his rage." "He's mad at you because he knows he's about to be evicted," said Laura. "And believe it or not, although Mr. Cudmore is a dangerous spirit, he will not be difficult to turf out because he's not a demonic entity. He's a disagreeable, insidious, unsavoury character, and there is a big difference." "So how are we going to free the trapped souls?" I asked. "Well, we're going to throw holy water throughout the house, and Pastor Lee Wotton is going to bless the entire place and command Mr. Cudmore to leave, and then we'll free the other spirits by the use of candles, prayers and meditation." All of a sudden, a glass vase on our coffee table lifted itself in the air and turned sideways and was flung violently in Laura's direction, landing only yards away from her and smashing on the floor, breaking into hundreds of sharp shards, and the pretty peony's petals were scattered on the ground liberally, rather like delicate confetti. Despite the violent demonstration from the cantankerous, fractious spirit of Mr. Cudmore, Laura appeared unfazed, as she had seen it all before, and she knew that the petulant, crabby, captious man was letting off steam. He knows the clock is ticking, she told us, and that he'll be leaving soon, so he's trying to ruffle our feathers by scaring us. It's important for us to remain grounded and calm, because spirits like Mr. Cudmore feed off fear, so don't oblige him by being at all anxious. Pastor Lee Wotton arrived on the scene with his Bible, crucifix and bottle of holy water. He was a short, stout man, with round spectacles and a bald, shiny head, framed by a round lion of scant hair. It would seem that from the moment he entered the house, he sensed the disagreeable and truculent spirit of Mr. Cudmore, and wasted no time in commanding him to leave at once. And as Laura had rightly predicted, the spirit didn't put up much of a fight, and suddenly we all witnessed this mysterious, dark, hazy smoke leaving the roof in a long, vertical line. Several minutes later, after everybody was holding hands and creating a ball of light in our minds, my wife and I physically saw these light orbs just lifting through the ceiling and disappearing from our sight. It was remarkable to observe. "They've all gone now," said Laura, "and the trapped spirits are now free. Is that not wonderful?" she said. For the first time since we moved into our home, we could sense a lightness to the place, almost as if the sunshine permeated and enveloped every room, and it had never felt this inviting and welcoming before. "Another thing," said Laura, "I'm being told you have a problem with hogs running amok over your land. Is that right?" I was astonished. "How do you know about this?" I asked. "Your friend out there in the woods has just told me that. You're a lucky man. It would seem he has your back. He's telling me he likes you very much indeed." "Who is she talking about?" my wife asked me, looking perturbed. "Well, remember the hairy creature that killed the hogs for us," I said. "I think that's who Laura is referring to." "Your friend is saying you're wanting to get some cows. Is that right?" asked Laura. "That's right," I said. "But not even my wife knows about this thought of mine. I don't understand how he could possibly know about this." "Your friend in the woods is called Falcon, and he knows quite a lot about you. I would say he's telepathic. He tells me it's very easy to read your mind because you don't hide your thoughts. He likes that about you. He says he's looking out for you and will help keep your hog population down and keep a watch over your cows when you get them. He says he respects you because you have a good heart, and he wants to thank your wife for the fruit, with the exception of the bananas. He doesn't like them at all. He says they taste like some beetle that he can't stand." "Tell him he's welcome," I said. "Tell him yourself," said Laura. "Remember, he reads your thoughts." That event happened over 20 years ago. It is scary how time flies. I'm now a 70-year-old man living on my farm, and I feel like I'm still 50. And to date, I've never had any problems with excessive hogs on my land. And the moment I introduced my cows to the pastures, I've never had any issues with them either. On one occasion, when one of my cows was down, I came outdoors to find her propped up with barrels of hay, which kept her stable, because lying flat on her sides can cause bloat and is fatal. I knew at once that my cow's life had been saved by Falcon. How had he known what to do? That is what was astonishing to me. On another occasion, one of my cows was struggling to give birth to her calf, as it had been breached, and I couldn't waste any time, so I hastily ran to the barn to get a chain to tie its legs. But when I returned, the baby calf had been successfully and safely born, and in the mud was a telltale 18-inch footprint, and I knew that Falcon had come to my assistance, because that footprint could not have belonged to anybody else. Over the years, he's helped us on multiple occasions, and even rescued a calf when it got trapped in a ditch, and its mother was so distressed that she ran up to the farmhouse to get my attention. I could see the dark, shadowy silhouette of Falcon retrieving my calf from the ditch. He lifted it up in his arms, like you and I would lift up a domestic cat. I sometimes refer to him as my invisible farmhand, who has offered me invaluable assistance over the years. I gather from a fellow I know from the Forestry Commission that the trees Falcon brought down have helped to thin the forest down, and he has removed trees that have been damaged also by fungus. We do get brief sightings of Falcon on our farm when he gives us a nod and just glides away. Over the years, my wife and I have left him parcels of food, which he always appreciates, but we find he dislikes bananas immensely because he always sends them back, which is hilariously funny. I now know that Falcon is a Bigfoot, and he is my best kept secret, and to this day I've never told anyone about him, until now, in this anonymous forum. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I decided to write to you in light of recent current events, where rumours are percolating around the globe about the very distinct possibility that we are being visited in our galaxy by extraterrestrial beings, where many of these species are believed to look remarkably like us, whilst others are exceedingly different life forms, from grey aliens to lizard-like humanoids, praying mantis beings, and of course so much more. Some of these beings appear to be benevolent and seem to have our best interests at heart and are interested in the advancement of humanity, while others have an insidious dark agenda, most particularly the Draco reptilians that are hideously ugly and look like nasty reptiles with vicious spiky sharp teeth, and these creatures feed off the energies and lower frequencies brought on by fear, from which they make a substance called loosh. Some emphatically believe that during the World War, these vindictive entities were drinking up the fearful energy of those gallant soldiers fighting to the death on our battlefields and getting high on the heightened levels of our terror. I have heard that even an Israeli minister recently dropped a few bombshells a couple of years ago, hinting that extraterrestrial beings have been visiting our world for over a century and popping in and out of our reality or dimension, if you like, which is why UFOs can sometimes materialize and then seem to vanish like magic before our eyes. I gather that government officials around the globe have been indirectly connecting with extraterrestrials, learning about new advanced technologies over 1,000 years ahead of our own, which they have hidden from us for their own nefarious agendas, like anti-gravity, medbeds, free energy, and so forth. It would seem that these outer-worldly beings, well, the good ones at least, have felt that humanity was not ready to learn about their existence, and were waiting on tender hooks for the right time to inform us about their existence, and with all the mumblings and faint whistlings from the Pentagon, one can only wonder what they're about to disclose to us, or whether we're going to be drip-fed the truth over a long period of time. I do not claim to be an expert on any of these matters, but I do believe we're not alone in the universe, due to an encounter I had at 15 years old, of which I have never forgotten. I want to assure you that I have a story to tell you that will make your hair stand on end, and make you question everything you thought you knew about our reality, as indeed it did this for me. At the time I was to realise that very few people would believe our outrageous, seemingly illusory, fanciful and fallacious story, and so we chose not to speak about it, and truly I thought that this would be a story that I would eventually take to the grave with me, as such was my reluctance and hesitancy to share it with anybody. However, I bravely decided to crawl out of the woodwork and make my story known, given the subject of UFOs has become a contentious but hot topic of late. My incredulous story also involves a seemingly erroneous encounter with an anomalous creature that we like to call Yeti, Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Some people believe that these creatures are connected to UFO encounters, and many don't even believe they exist at all in our reality. But I can assure you that they most certainly do, for I have seen this creature with my very own eyes. The year was 1992, and it was, as they say, a cool but very pleasant summer. I was 15 years old at the time, and went to spend my summer holidays with my cousins on their unparalleled sprawling cattle ranch in Utah that was surrounded by flowering meadows, grazing pastures, mountainous valleys, and a large silvery lake flanked by willow trees. And then there was a ubiquitous area of wood green comprised of juniper, Douglas firs, spruce and ash trees. Utah is a region in the western United States that consists of high plateaus, exquisite mountains and even deserts, and is very similar to Colorado in its rugged, natural, awe-inspiring beauty, with convenient access to exquisite mountains and a stunning, beautiful climate. Both of my cousins were of similar age to me. My older cousin Robert was 16, and my younger cousin Timothy was about 14 at the time. We called ourselves the Three Musketeers, as by nature we were three rambunctious, energetic and active teenagers. We loved nothing better than exploring the great outdoors together, riding our mountain bikes or even our horses, and playing all kinds of crazy games together, which involved a great deal of daredevil stunts or practical jokes, as we were very big on the humour lark. On one dinner party my mother was actually hosting, we used a very loud fart machine to make the most horrendous noises, and everybody believed my mother was farting, and my dad took her surreptitiously to one side and said, "What the hell have you been eating, love? You're farting to high heaven, and I'm feeling very embarrassed. Can you not see the way that everybody is looking at you and covering their noses with their napkins in anticipation of an odorous smell?" "But it's not me," my mother had insisted, looking utterly mortified. As young teenagers, we were also fascinated by things you cannot explain, most especially the paranormal and ghostly phenomena, especially me. And it was this interest that led us to experience the night of our lives that we would hardly be ever likely to forget. It all began over an open fire pit on a Sunday night after a delicious barbecue dinner, when we began to tell ghost stories and roast marshmallows over the open flames. "Do you believe in ghosts?" I asked my Uncle Matt.
You have to believe in stuff like that, Kurt, when you live around here, he said. I can tell you that many of the ranchers in the area that live close to those canyons have heard what can only be described as blood-curdling screams of a woman in distress or someone being murdered, and they've heard a baby crying and the sound of wailing. Everybody believes that those canyons are terribly haunted.
"I'm fascinated by stuff you can't explain, Uncle Matt," I piped. "Will you let us go camping around the canyon for a night or so? We'd love to go ghost hunting. It would be so much fun."
"Kurt," said my uncle, looking at me solemnly, "many of those ranchers would be too terrified to spend a night out there in the canyon, given the sounds that they have heard. And these are grown men with nerves of steel that we're talking about. I'm not sure it would be wise for you to go camping out there, even for only a night."
"Oh, please, Daddy," Timothy begged. "We're not scared. We'd love to go camping there. I've always wanted to see a ghost, and camping around the canyon will be ever so much fun, even if we don't see anything."
"I'm not sure you will see a ghost, son," said my Uncle Matt, stroking his moustache reflectively. "In fact, I think it very unlikely. But I'm just concerned about the disembodied haunted screams you might hear. They could frighten you out of your wits. And it's not fun being scared when you're out on your own. Believe me, I know."
"Your uncle's right, dear," said my Aunt Lydia. "I have heard those screams before myself, and I haven't ever been that frightened before." "We aren't scared, Uncle Matt," I piped. "We're intrigued and curious. We're not asking for much, just one day on our own camping out in the canyon. That's all we're asking for."
"Oh, go on," said Aunt Lydia, giving us an encouraging wink.
"For goodness sake, Matt, stop being such a stick in the mud, will you? The kids want to go camping for just one night. What harm can it possibly do? Stop being so overprotective. Our children are teenagers now, and they're astute and sensible. You can pick them up the following morning if you like, but let them have this solo adventure. You know how things like this meant a big deal to you when you were growing up. Are you going to deny your children this wonderful adventure?"
"Oh, very well," said Uncle Matt. "Lydia has persuaded me to change my mind, but you must be careful, as there are mountain lions in the area and other indigenous wild animals like cougars and elks, so you need to take my rifle with you. If you want to camp anywhere else, I would not be so concerned, but those canyons are very haunting. As you can imagine, my cousins and I were absolutely ecstatic and over the moon that my uncle had finally conceded and agreed to let us go camping, and we could hardly believe our good fortune. "You're a rock star, Kurt," said Timothy, giving me a high five. "I never thought we'd ever see the day when Dad would let us camp in the canyon. This is the best news ever." Before long, my Uncle Matt had dropped us off near our camping site in the early afternoon, and armed with our backpacks, we reached an open clearing, where we hitched up our tents, facing the rear side of a magnificent, voluptuous, very statuesque canyon that became like a huge windbreak for us. Our tent overlooked an exquisite silvery stream that meandered through the valley, and was fringed by a resplendent wooded area that, after a short trek by foot, eventually opened up into an extensive, pretty, flowery prairie filled with summer flowers and high brush that was flanked by sensational mountainous ridges. I do remember being overawed by the magnificence of the canyon and its incredible jaw-dropping, awe-inspiring scenery that was quite literally breathtaking. "This is awesome," said Timothy. "I couldn't imagine camping anywhere else in the world. It's mind-blowingly beautiful out here." It was a particularly glorious day, as the weather was moderate, neither too hot nor too cold, and we decided to leave our camp and go exploring, and we ventured through the wooded area, and noticed to our surprise that some thin-looking tree limbs, or saplings if you like, had been arranged deliberately in a rather menacing, inauspicious way, in a vague, abstract shape of a tepi, using a few scant branches to make these sinister symbolic shapes. And we also discerned that many of these branches through the wood green had been intentionally snapped, sometimes from a very great height. If I was to see such a display exhibited in a museum of contemporary art, it would give me the impression that the artist was conveying a sinister, baleful message, much like a very large get-out sign that was very unfriendly and most unwelcome. "I know who did this," I said to my cousins. "I bet you it was some kids having a laugh or a practical joke to scare visitors to the canyon. Let's face it, the way they've arranged these branches to look so ominous and creepy, they've done an excellent job. I do have to say I hand it to them. I'm not sure I could have done it better myself." "You're right," said Robert, chuckling. "I must admit I'm secretly impressed myself, because looking at these tree boughs, it's giving me the chills. It looks very pretentious and menacious, almost like the perfect setting for a horror movie. Or a haunting," I joked. As you can imagine, the wooded area was extremely lovely, and the fresh smell of pine permeated the air with a refreshing sweet minty scent, and the whole area was alive with pretty birdsong. It truly didn't get better than this. On our return hike back to the tent, we were rather bewildered to see that some of our items that we had packed away had been displaced. My large anorak was hanging precariously from a branch in the tree, and our torchlights and cooler box with all the soda cans was lying strewn all over the clearing, and Timothy's sleeping bag was lying on the grass, spread out like a picnic blanket. It was exceedingly bizarre, but I began to grin like a Cheshire cat as I surveyed the area with a glint of amusement in my eyes. "I fail to see what's so funny," said Robert. "Who could have done this?" "Don't you see?" I laughed. "It's Uncle Matt. He's trying to scare us. He knows we came here to be spooked, and he thought he'd play a joke on us. But he's not fooling anyone, least of all me." At that, both my cousins began to laugh. "Of course," they said. "Dad has a wicked sense of humour. He must have done this. This is his kind of prank." As I began to replace all the cans in the cooler box, I discerned a very large footprint in a muddy patch close to the stream that was 20 inches long in size, and upon seeing this, I immediately destroyed the evidence, because I realised that someone who'd been messing around our campsite was possibly not my Uncle Matt after all, but the curious owner of the hugest feet that I've ever seen. But whose hideously big feet they were, I couldn't imagine, and why they'd been running around the place barefoot was anyone's guess. Who does that in their right mind when there are thorny briars lying around the place and rattlesnakes that could leap out of the shadows and bite you when you least expect it?
I knew that seeing such unsettling evidence might make my cousins lose their nerve about staying in the canyon, and I was not going to allow that to happen under any circumstances. I was fueled with a fervent excitement about what this night would hold for us, and no one was going to rob me of that. We sat back on our comfortable camp chairs, seemingly mesmerised by the flickering bright orange flames of our fire, crackling, folding and burning the wood under the light of an ivory crescent moon and a scattering of silvery stars, which illuminated the dark sky with a dazzling, resplendent display of glittering diamonds. Then we heard the sounds of the croaking frogs and the chirping crickets that serenaded us with their nightly chorus. In the distance we could hear what sounded like the calls of coyotes and the hoots of an owl. We roasted our marshmallows, washed down with the steaming hot cups of chocolate, and I informed my cousins about the night's itinerary that lay ahead of us, as I considered myself the most enlightened authority about ghostly phenomena. We will go to bed early, I told them, and we'll set the alarm for 12:30, and we'll see if we can hear any of those disembodied screams, and then we'll try and locate their source and their origin. "Do you think we'll see a ghost tonight?" asked Timothy excitedly. "I hope so," I said, "but I can't be sure about that, so I'm not making any promises to you. But this is a likely spot, if any, for paranormal activity, and let's not forget that this place has a history of being haunted." After we retired to our sleeping bags, I think we must have fallen asleep very rapidly, for I suddenly found myself being shaken vigorously by Robert in the middle of the night. "Where's Timothy?" he asked me. "I can't find him anywhere. Have you seen him?" he said, growing alarmed. "He's not anywhere in the tent." I groaned. He either went to answer a call of nature, or he decided to go exploring without us," I said. "Why would he do that? We're in this together. That was very selfish of him." At this suggestion, Robert visibly relaxed, and the tension evaporated from his anxious face. "You're right," he agreed. "It's one hell of a cheek of my brother. He's always been so competitive. He possibly wanted a ghostly sighting before us, so that he could boast. That would be so typical of him. Let's go and find him." We both eagerly put on our headlamps and ventured swiftly through the wooded area, and I was feeling exceedingly excited. I had butterflies in my stomach, because deep in my gut I had the sententious revelatory feeling that something quite extraordinary was going to happen. All of a sudden we were drawn towards this very peculiar but very beguiling green light that permeated through the trees, lighting up an extensive area in a bright green luminescence, similar in colour to a green traffic light, but much more ethereal, delicate and mysterious looking. It would seem that our enchanting, rather magical walk through the wood green was lit up by this sweeping, all-embracing, incandescent effulgence, and this strange light emission appeared to be coming from the open prairie. I could feel my heart thundering through my chest like a booming drum, and the adrenaline was coursing through my veins like a steam train on full throttle. I was bursting with curiosity as something very strange was happening. I could feel it in my bones, sense it, and even taste it on my tongue. I wanted to find out what it was that was going on in this open prairie, and thoughts as to the whereabouts of my missing cousin had long since evaporated. Robert and I cautiously tiptoed through the wood green, moving with the stealth of a cheetah from one tree to another, and switching off our headlights as our visibility was excellent. We were very, very careful and cautious as we walked. Reaching the edge of the wood green, we crawled down on our hands and knees through the long brush of the prairie, trying to remain inconspicuous, until we were lying only feet away from what I can only describe as a large flying saucer or silvery disc that was easily the size of an Olympic swimming pool and about the height of a 5-story building. It was parked there in the middle of the open prairie, and this thing was so spectacularly huge, but the metal was seamless, and I didn't discern any windows or doors, although I did detect a very strange, peculiar writing on the metal that looked like Egyptian hieroglyphics. My cousin and I were so transfixed and beguiled by what we were witnessing, as this strange metallic disc-like object
submersed in this luminescent green light, emitted a sound much like the crickets.
It was made from a silvery metal, very different to anything I've ever seen on Earth before, with a very exquisite sheen, the brightness of the silver that we're acquainted with. All of a sudden a door just mysteriously appeared and opened in the middle of this craft, and these steps popped out in a single second, much like the steps on a jumbo jet. But these steps were so much more superior and far less cumbersome and ungainly. It was like the steps were as delicate and as fragile as crystal, but I'm sure they were strong and shatterproof. They just looked incredibly elegant. I kid you not, walking down the steps with two beings was my brother. What the heck was he doing? It seemed like he was smiling from ear to ear and communicating with these strange beings, but although he looked like he was talking, no one appeared to move their mouths, not even my brother. The two handsome men standing next to my cousin were not of this world, and I knew that instinctively and immediately, although they did look remarkably human. There was something about their energy that was exceedingly different to ours, and it was almost as if a golden aura was very discernible on the outside of their bodies, like a flattering ethereal light. These men towered at about 6 foot tall, with lean muscular bodies, and long blonde hair that was bobbed at the shoulders. Their skin was very pale, and their eyes Arctic blue. I do remember they were wearing very strange, peculiar clothes that were like long bodysuits, made of a silvery material that looked far more sophisticated and much more high-tech than anything you ever saw on Star Trek or any of those high-tech fabrics you can buy today. As my brother reached the bottom of the steps, a huge black shadowy figure came darting through the trees. At first I had no clue what this outlandish creature was, but now all these years later I know him to be a Bigfoot. The creature stood up on 2 legs and was easily over 7 foot tall and 700 pounds. He was long, sinewy and lean, but powerfully built like an indestructible army tank, and was covered from head to toe with long black shaggy hair, and he possessed an arch-shaped head that beheld the markings of a very human-like face, with dark leathery skin, a flat, almost aquatic nose, and deep-set dark eyes. The critter appeared to be talking to the 2 men, but they never moved their mouths, which was exceedingly odd, so I do believe the conversation was obviously telepathic. I watched the 2 friendly men walk up the steps and wave at my brother, and then these steps just whirled up into the craft, and you couldn't see any signs that there was an opening in the craft, as the whole flying disc appeared seamless and flawless. We watched this craft lifting itself up into the air in a long vertical line, and then it turned into a 2 o'clock position and whizzed off at one hell of a speed, and before our eyes it vanished and dematerialized from our sight. I now believe it was due to some sophisticated cloaking technology that rendered it invisible, but of this fact I cannot be certain. Robert and I crept back ever so cautiously through the brush, keeping our steely eyes pinned on Timothy and maintaining a very good distance behind him so as not to be seen and discovered by the creature, who was walking very comfortably by his side. They trekked through the wood green together for quite a while, until the creature pointed towards our tent, and Timothy nodded and trotted towards the tent dutifully, turning around to wave at the creature as if to say thank you and goodbye. He nodded at my cousin and then glided away, moving down the mountainous terrain with the efficiency and grace of a mountain goat, and my cousin and I were bedazzled by this mysterious creature, whatever in God's name it actually was. My cousin and I hightailed it right back to the tent, with one purpose alone, and that was to interrogate Timothy. We wanted to know everything that had happened to him. "Where have you been, Timothy? We saw you in that big flying saucer, talking to those strange men. What do they want with you? And who was that big hairy gorilla man that guided you back to your tent?" "I'm not supposed to say where I've been," said Timothy, clambering up. "It's a secret." "Timothy," I chided, "we saw you. If you don't tell us what happened to you, then I'll tell Uncle Matt exactly what you did." At that horrifying revelation, Tim swore us to secrecy, and this was his incredible story. I was sleeping in my tent, and I heard the strange voice in my head say, "Wake up! I need to take you to the craft now." I pulled the sleeping bag over my head, but I heard the voice say, "Don't go back to sleep, young boy. I need to take you to the craft. All will be well, and you are in safe hands." I knew that something had been talking to me in my head, because it was very different to the sound of your own thoughts. At that moment I climbed out of the tent, and that was when I saw the monstrous creature standing there, indicating for me to follow him. I was terribly afraid, because this daunting, hairy, ape-like humanoid was terrifying and very intimidating. I was about to scream in horror when the creature looked at me and spoke directly to my mind. "Young boy, don't be afraid. I may look very scary, but I'm actually rather nice, and you can trust me to take care of you. I need to take you to the craft, for we have work to do this night." For some reason I was drawn to follow him, not through my own will, but through some kind of pulling feeling that made me desirous to follow the creature, and so I did. The next thing I knew was that I was sitting in what I can only describe as an intelligent chair, because it appeared to be monitoring everything like my heartbeat and my pulse and other things I didn't understand, and I was buckled to it by a seatbelt. I was surrounded by all this incredible technology, unlike anything I've ever observed before. It was too daunting to take in, because it was so overwhelming. Then those two blonde-haired men came to speak to me. They asked me all kinds of strange questions, but they didn't speak to me in words. They spoke to me directly in my head, and we conversed backwards and forwards like that. "What kind of questions did they ask you?" I asked. "They asked me if I believed that there was life on other planets, and what did the boys in my class think about the subject. Did I think UFOs were real? How did I think my friends would react if they knew aliens were real and were visiting us?" It was kind of questions like that they asked. "What did you say?" I said. "Well, I said that we had movies about aliens and stuff like that, but I didn't actually believe that aliens were real, and neither did any of my friends. We just saw alien movies as entertainment, and most of them were horrible monsters that eat up people and were very, very scary." Then they asked me if I thought people would be afraid of aliens, and I told them that I thought so based on what we actually see on television, because I told them we didn't actually see any nice aliens. "What did they say to you?" I asked. "They said that they were from another planet or star system, but I forgot the name. They had a different frequency and density to ours. They said that there are many good aliens that are very interested in helping our Earth evolve. I was told their people can live well over 1,000 years, and that if you were 100 years old from where they come from, you would be considered a baby. The tall blonde men were both about 500 years old." "You're kidding me," I said. "They looked like they were in their late 20s. They looked so young." They said that everybody is free on their planet because it's your birthright to be free. They find it very strange that we have to buy food and shelter on our planet, which they believe is reprehensible and morally wrong. "Everything is free," I piped, "where they come from? That's incredible." "You know what?" said Robert. "They're right. Everything should be free on our planet. It is our God-given birthright, but it isn't, because we're being robbed through taxes, loans, and debt. It's crazy if you think about it." "What else did they say?" I asked. "Nothing, really. They thanked me for my information and said I'd been very informative. And then I left the craft, and that big hairy creature came to collect me and bring me back here. They said that our Earth was too green, too young and immature, but they said when our Earth begins to bud, the time will be right to reveal to humanity the existence of stargates, portals, time travel, frequencies, alien species, UFOs, and so much more. The rest of that glorious night, my cousins and I sat talking until the morning broke, and if indeed there were any ghosts wandering around the canyon, or any disembodied shouts and screams, we failed to hear them. But what we encountered that night superseded our wildest expectations of what we'd hoped to encounter, and our experience completely shifted our beliefs about our reality. I do believe it was a Bigfoot that had gone through our stuff during the day, and I'm not sure I know what he was looking for, or why he selected my youngest cousin Timothy to visit the ET humans in the craft, and in what way he appeared to be connected to those extraterrestrial humans. Another strange thing that happened is that after 24 hours, my cousin Timothy had absolutely no memory or recollection of his time spent in the craft, or even of the Bigfoot creature he encountered. But both Robert and I have never forgotten what I can only describe as the most extraordinary night of my life. So there you are. That's my story.
And tonight's story is particularly lovely. It's a story from an EMT, someone who works in the emergency services, and she talks about how she had a patient who had a really terrible attack with a wild animal. And she found out that this creature that attacked this girl was in fact a Bigfoot. But she didn't believe the girl. She thought the girl was lying or making it up, until she herself saw a Bigfoot when she was on duty in her ambulance. And so the story goes on, and I know you're going to love it. So let's get started. And she calls the letter, "My startling revelation, OMG, Bigfoot is real." So she says here, "Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Frances and I'm from Central Oregon. I'm an EMT worker for accident and emergency cases in and around our area. As I want to remain anonymous, I would like to keep all my details as vague as possible, if you do not mind. I wonder how many of your listeners would have believed me if I had told them a year ago about the COVID-19 pandemic. Would your listeners have believed it if I had told them what was going to transpire around the globe? We would experience mask wearing, social distancing, and even lockdowns, depending, of course, whereabouts we live in the world. I would never have believed it was possible until I witnessed it with my own eyes. The sad reality of human nature is our continuous skepticism and our inability to believe something until we see it with our own eyes. I think people who have faith or religion are more likely to believe in something like Bigfoot because they believe in something that they cannot see, and that belief is called faith. Working as an EMT in the pandemic has been very surreal for me. But for those who have not seen what's going on in the front line, I can understand how it's easy to potentially fail to understand how real this crisis has actually become. So let's get on with my story about the elusive hairy man known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot. I just want to say that I rarely regret my cynicism in believing that this creature did not exist. I was one of those faithless people that I'm talking about, that had to see it to believe it, or otherwise, as far as I was concerned, it emphatically could not be true. One day on an accident and emergency case, I had to pick up a young woman of about 22 years old who had been attacked by a wild animal. When I got her on the stretcher and put her in the ambulance, I could see how traumatized the girl was, which was understandable. She was shaking violently and her teeth were chattering as if she was cold, but it was a very warm day. I never forget the way her eyes looked. They had this vacant, faraway look in them, as if she was reliving the horror that she had just been through. The girl was in a bad way because her arm was almost torn off her body and both her legs were badly crushed with multiple fractures. I tried to be light-hearted about the matter in order to cheer up the distressed girl. "Must have been some attack," I said to her. "Was it a mountain lion or a bear?" I asked. "Who did this to you?" The girl paused and looked at me solemnly. "You wouldn't believe it if I told you." I did not hesitate to assure her that I was not the disbelieving type, but in hindsight I clearly was, based on my judgments and fixed beliefs. I believe it was a Bigfoot that attacked me, but it's a long story. I know the expression on my face literally read, "I do not believe you. Bigfoot doesn't exist." The girl looked at me in frustrated resignation. "All right," she said, "it was a bear. It was a bear that attacked me. Are you happy now?" I never thought much about the incident until 5 years later. I was driving down a remote country road to pick up an accident and emergency case. A woman had had a heart attack. When lo and behold, I suddenly saw a big black mass standing on the side of the road, and it had big brown curious eyes. At first I thought I was seeing a bear, but as I got closer to make a turn to the left in the road, I saw the creature extremely clearly, and what I saw was beyond what I imagined even existed here in North America. The creature was definitely a Bigfoot, and I knew that the second I got a closer look. There was no doubt. I would say this thing was 7 foot tall and was exceedingly broad, especially in the upper torso area, which includes arms, chest, and shoulders. The creature did not have a neck, but a big A-shaped head that was like cone-like in its appearance. His grey facial skin was hairless, and he had a fat nose like a pygmy, thin lips, and big bright brown eyes. His whole body was covered in dark brown hair with auburn highlights, but it was not as dense as I would have imagined a Bigfoot's hair to be. The creature was huge, which was why I thought he was a large bear in the first place. I imagine many people may have mistaken Bigfoot for a bear because it would be easy to do if you were not looking closely enough. I wonder how many people actually have seen Bigfoot and not realized, looked at a bear and thought it was a Bigfoot. I was in too much of a rush to get to my patient, but I did get to have eye contact with the creature, and it was like he was looking through me, giving me the impression he could mind read, but that was probably fanciful thinking on my part. The encounter was over so swiftly because it was a brief observation of that creature. Suddenly my thoughts went back to the accident and emergency case I had experienced with a young woman 5 years earlier who had claimed to have been savaged by a Bigfoot. And when I had disbelieved her, she had backed up on her story and said that it was all a bear attack. Maybe she really had been attacked by a Bigfoot, I thought. Suddenly I remember the doubt and disbelief I had experienced when she told me her story. I now knew that her initial explanation of what had happened to her was probably true, and I knew I needed to make amends when I was off duty. Not only that, but I was also curious to find out what had led to her attack, and I got a feeling she would not be willing to talk. I was right, of course. The girl remembered me clearly as she invited me into her home and was rather offhand at me. "It's you," she said. "What do you want?" "I want to apologize for not believing you when you told me that you were attacked by a Bigfoot." The girl seemed surprised by my apology, but she continued to lie. "I told you it was a bear attack," she said, "and nothing more. It was a bear that attacked me." "That's what you said after I did not believe you, when you said it was a Bigfoot." "I told you it was a bear," she insisted. "Please just go. I've not got time to just sit and argue. I made all that Bigfoot stuff up," she said. "No, you did not," I said, firmly parking myself on her sofa. "I'm not going anywhere until you tell me your story." The girl looked frustrated. "Why now?" she asked, "after all this time? I do not understand. Are you here to make fun of me or tease me about believing in Bigfoot?" "Not at all," I said, pausing. "I have seen one too, you know, and that's why I'm here, because I believe you now." "Where?" asked the girl. And that was when I told her my story. Suddenly the girl seemed to relax, and then she admitted the truth to me. "It was a Bigfoot," she said, "but if you tell anyone that that is what I said, I will deny it at all costs, and you will be the one that looks like a prize idiot. Do you understand?" I nodded in agreement. "Please tell me what happened," I begged. "I do believe you." Now I'm going to tell you her story in her words, which she has agreed to share with your audience, providing she remains anonymous. "I had been seeing this creature coming into our garden from time to time," she said. "It would happen all so very quickly, so much so that I would sometimes wondered if I had imagined it. I had been seeing all these programs about Bigfoot, so I was terribly excited that what I was seeing could be the real deal. One day in our garden I saw this really huge footprint that was 18 inches, and it was of a bare foot, with the toe at an angle, which I knew meant that this creature had never worn shoes. Now I was convinced that this shadowy thing that I saw very fast on a regular basis may indeed have been a Bigfoot. At night I would go into the garden and hear whooping sounds and also tree knocks, so I knew there was something in the forest. On occasion we would hear dreadful screams like a woman being assaulted, and I also put that scream down to a Bigfoot. One day I decided to do my own squatching. That's what they call it in the Bigfoot community, you know. The national forest opposite our home goes on forever and a day. It's absolutely enormous, so the creature could be anywhere. However, that did not deter me or put me off in any way. I was determined to have my own Bigfoot encounter, or at least find more evidence as to his existence. When I entered the forest, I followed the trail of deer scat, because I believed that a Bigfoot would hang around a food source. I ended up in a clearing where there was a creek and tons of deer scat everywhere, and I was thrilled. I then came across this weird tent-like structure, much like a teepee, made completely out of timber. It looked like it was a man-made structure, but it would have taken somebody awfully big to stack up all that timber in the shape of a small tent, and for what purpose I wouldn't know. I looked inside the teepee, or whatever it was called, and there was a large nest in there, big enough for a huge animal to sleep on. And the thing that really clinched the deal for me was that it stunk to high heaven of the skunky perspiration kind of smell. I believed at that moment that I had struck pay dirt, and this was indeed Bigfoot's sleeping place. I could see no sign of the creature apart from things that made me believe that this was indeed his territory. Some of the timber in the woods was placed in such a way that it looked as if some kind of marking of territory or something. It was sort of like a barricade here and a curled tree trunk there. It had all been purposely done. The next day I got up really early because I wanted to spy on the Bigfoot teepee. I was also sure he would be there, and I felt terribly excited. I did not think for a moment that I would be in danger because Bigfoots have so many human-like characteristics. I did not think such a creature would see me as a threat, but I guess I was wrong. Anyway, as I got into the forest, I did think it was awfully quiet. In truth, that level of stillness was a little disconcerting for me. There were no bird calls, and that was odd, because I always hear the dawn chorus early in the morning, but not on this day. Finally, I reached the clearing and the creek, and was surprised to see no deer gathering there for their morning drink. I then did a very silly thing that I regret to this very day. I snuck up to the teepee, and was thrilled to hear this loud snoring, and it was noisy but also human-like and very nasal. I peered into the nest cavity of the teepee, or whatever you'd like to call it. I could see this large hairy form lying on the ground, fast asleep, inside this teepee. All I could see was this thing was big and hairy, and I wanted to get a look at the face, so I peered closer. I was shocked with what the girl was telling me. I would never be so bold as to go out to an apex predator's nest and peer inside. What happened next? I asked. I saw one eye open, and then another, and it looked as if the creature was shocked and surprised to see me there, just staring at him. I think I would be too, I said. If I was a Bigfoot minding my own business and a nosy human comes along and snoops in on me, I think it would bother me a lot, especially if I was the elusive type, and we know that Bigfoot is. What did he do? I asked. He jumped up out of his nest and let out the most terrifying scream, said the girl. It was so earth-shattering that it caused my whole body to vibrate. He then roared at me with a sound far more intimidating than the lions that you see on Animal Planet. I was scared out of my mind. My heart was pounding, but I just could not run. I just stood there like a complete idiot. I think this creature wanted me to just go away. So I must have looked extremely obstinate, just standing there. But the truth is, I could not move a muscle. I felt completely tied to the spot. It really felt as if my whole body weighed an absolute ton, and all I could do was just stand there shaking non-stop. It was just like my body refused to listen to my mind, which was telling it to run, but I just couldn't. I don't know why. What did the creature look like? I asked. Well, he was a big fellow, she said. I guess he weighed 600 pounds. But I've never been good at that sort of stuff. I would say he could have been 7 feet, but I'm not certain about that either. All I do know was that he was massive. He was big, he was muscular, and he was very, very strong. I knew the moment I saw him that it would take nothing for him to kill me. He could have torn me into two. It would have been easy for him to do that. What about his hair? I asked. What was that like? It was cinnamon brown, but not dense like some people describe. It seemed like he could have alopecia because he had bald areas on his body, which enabled me to see his muscles. He did have the kind of rack that men aspire to, you know. He had muscles absolutely everywhere. I guess you could say he was ripped. What did he do next? I asked. That's the funny thing. He pulled my arm, but it was so hard the way he pulled it. I don't think he meant it to be that hard. It was like he was pushing me away, but my arm physically tore and the skin ripped too. I then fell over, and then he pushed my legs down with his thunder thighs like I was something unwanted on the forest floor. But the weight of his leg was so massive and so heavy, he actually crushed my legs in the process. I did have extensive surgery on them, she said. The doctor could not figure why my bones were crushed like this. What happened next? I asked. After I screamed, the creature looked almost sorry for what he'd done. He seemed to regret what he'd done, and I got the impression that he was upset with himself. Well, he just picked me up and carried me outside the forest on the outside clearing near the main road and just left me there. Wow, I said. In the end, he showed you some compassion, I suppose. Well, I could feel him watching me as I just lay on the ground until a car stopped and then finally called the ambulance. When help arrived, I could hear him going away because he sounded like a rhino bolting off. He really did. It was weird. So that was the story. The creature reacted aggressively, but when it saw he had hurt her, he made sure he got her help by placing her in a strategic position so that someone would call for help. I believe vehemently that this girl's story was true, but stories as dramatic as this rarely get told because of people like me, or rather like I used to be, that are so unbelieving that unless they see it, they just would never take you seriously. This, I believe, is an ideal forum to tell our stories, so we do not face the brutal, unkind, judgmental attitudes of non-believers. I understand where they're coming from because I was one of them too. But is it not sad to have no faith whatsoever? I think it is. Well, I do want to say that I do agree with you about not having faith. I think it's very easy for us to doubt something that we haven't seen, and I do love the way you start off your letter and talk about the COVID-19 pandemic, because if you had told me last year that this was going to happen to us and that we were going to experience lockdown and masks and the whole palaver, I would never have believed it was possible, but it happened. And I do understand how it's easy to dismiss Bigfoot as a reality unless you've physically seen him. But there are many believers among us who have never ever seen Bigfoot, and I'm glad to say and proud to say that I'm one of them, because I do think it is liberating to believe in something that you haven't seen, and I think the evidence is overwhelming. And I'm very, very grateful for people who've got the courage to tell us their phenomenal stories, and we are indeed getting some phenomenal stories, and I'm sure you'll agree with that.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Hamish, and I was fortunate and privileged enough to grow up in the resplendent, idyllic countryside of rural Montana, surrounded by visually panoramic, breathtaking views over the exquisite mountainous valleys, canyons, prairies, flowery meadows, silvery lakes, and large clusters of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs sprinkled liberally throughout the countryside, often in ordered rows or clusters. Living in this part of the world does have its distinct disadvantages and drawbacks, because cell phone reception and internet signals can be exceedingly lousy, even in this day and age, which is something that newcomers to our area find exceedingly frustrating. In my experience, the further you live away from town, the more likely you are to face some poor, rugged and badly maintained roads that during the winter months can present all kinds of problems for drivers. The biggest issue, of course, is beyond question the heavy snowfall we get here, as it can be chaotic in this part of the world. And those roads can become exceedingly treacherous as we have no guardrails up, and so you can slide precariously all over the place while you're driving. As a result, we are permitted to drive with studded tyres during the winter months. We also get all kinds of wildlife here, from bears to wolves, elk and mule deer. And if you have chicken or animal feed lying around, you may be encouraging wildlife on your property, most especially bears. And believe me, as lovable as these creatures may be, they can be a huge menace. On one occasion, a bear cleaned me out of a huge bag of dog food meant to last an entire month that I'd accidentally left outside of my car, and it finished it in less than an hour, which my children at the time found hilariously funny. When my wife Eartha and I got married, we moved to a small, steep, mountainous plot of land, surrounded by a vast backdrop of exquisite rugged outcrops, flowery prairies, and an extensive area of wood green that stretched back for many miles. We lived in an attractive ranch-style home situated at the top of this elevated incline, where the ground was flattened out into a sizable luxury turfed yard, which was conveniently located 25 minutes away from town. I worked from a workshop on my property, restoring old furniture, for an upmarket company where I made personalised kitchen cabinets to order from select pieces of fine cherry, birch, or special coated or primed woods for the very affluent or over-particular clients who wished to splash out on their homes and required something specialised and out of the ordinary for their kitchens. My incredulous story that ultimately led to my outlandish Bigfoot encounter happened after my kids had long since left home. I was about 55 years old at the time. It would seem that a new resident had bought the next-door neighbour's house and had literally dotted his entire property, which was much like ours, very rugged and mountainous, with hundreds of beat-up, clapped-out old cars and all kinds of ancient, rusty, prehistoric farm machinery that looked like it belonged in an agriculture museum and not in a yard. I have to confess his whole yard was a dreadful excrescence, almost like a bomb had hit the place, and it was a huge defacement or eyesore if you like, yet there wasn't a whole lot I could actually do about it. I did, however, decide to pay him a cordial visit, but by the looks of this disagreeable, obnoxious man, who wore a perpetual scowl on his weathered face, I knew that I was going to have a tumultuous time and invariably be walking on eggshells. I could sense that anything would set him off much like a spark to a firework that would ultimately become a volatile, potentially explosive situation that I would do well to avoid, because I didn't want to be on the receiving end of this man's wrath. In truth, it was a little bit like approaching an aggressive dog with caution, very warily watchful that he wasn't going to pounce on me in any given moment. His name was Byron Pepper, and he had those very deep-set, squinty eyes that you could barely see, rather like a bull terrier's, and a rugged, uneven, pitted complexion, and thin lips that were permanently turned upside down into a scowl, that was complemented by a wispy, thin grey beard. The worst part of it all was that this man's size was exceedingly intimidating, for he was built like a huge wrestler, with heavily tattooed muscles on him that were so large that his biceps virtually bubbled, and he was eager to show off his powerful assets, for he wore a scant white string vest and a thick gold chain around his neck. As I approached him, I knew that I would rather be anywhere else right now in the entire world than on his property, for the energy this man exuded was dark and menacing and hardly friendly. I instinctively knew in this instant that we were unlikely to ever be friends. "Who are you?" he barked at me aggressively as I approached him cautiously, with a very evident reluctance that was hard to disguise. "I'm your next-door neighbour," I said, with a tremble in my voice, reaching out cordially to shake his hand in a gesture of friendliness. He did not take my hand, but eyed me suspiciously. "What do you want?" he snapped. "I just wanted to say hello," I said. "I live next door in the ranch home with my wife Eartha. My name is Hamish." "Hamish," he scoffed. "Ha ha!
I knew a man when I was inside that was called that hideous name. Thought he was above everybody else, he did. A big, pretentious snob he was. I brought him down to size after I beat him up very badly. From that moment on, that man learnt some manners, and soon learnt who called the shots.
You were inside, I asked, looking at him aghast, but trying to suppress my obvious shock. What for, may I ask?
For attempted murder, robbery, and assault. But I got out early for good behaviour, he said,
almost as if he was boastful of his impressive rap sheet. Good for you, I said, trying to sound happy for him. What are you going to do with all these old cars, may I ask? Are they going to be moved soon? Some of them are hanging over the rocky outcrops rather precariously and could potentially fall down in any given moment. I worry that a little wind could cause them to tumble over at any time.
Oh, I see what this is all about, he laughed. You're worried I'm spoiling your pretty little view. I might have guessed. So this is not really a friendly neighbourly visit after all, is it?
Well, it is a little bit of a blot on the landscape, you have to admit. Montana is exquisitely beautiful. It seems a pity to spoil the countryside with all these rusty, dilapidated pieces of junk. My wife isn't happy about how unsightly it all looks. It downgrades the whole place, making everything look squalid and unkept.
Get out, screamed the man. What I do on my land is my business. How dare you lecture me? If you don't move your posh little butt off my premises, I'll do it for you myself. And that shouldn't be hard, because you're at the very least a little piddling £170. You don't want to be on the receiving end of one of my punches. Inside, I was not called the Terminator for nothing.
After what I can only describe as a pugnacious, belligerent outburst, I quickly scurried away, very hurriedly, like a frightened rabbit, glancing over my shoulders to see the man laughing at me. I was seriously regretting that I'd even bothered to pay him a visit. What was I thinking? When I told my wife about my less than amicable encounter with our warmongering badass neighbour, she wasn't pleased. "He's been in prison for attempted murder," she gasped, looking at me with eyes growing as round as saucers and her jaw dropping to the ground. "You've got to be kidding! What is he doing living next door to us? This is dreadful news. We are living next door to a murderer." "Well, to give him his due, he has served his sentence," I said to my wife, "and it was attempted murder, not murder, and frankly, unless we move, we're pretty much stuck with him. I get the very strong impression that the heaps of junk in that yard are not going anywhere any time soon, I regret to have to say. We must avoid this truculent, confrontational man like the plague," said my wife. "His sort are not worth messing with. We need to stay out of his way at all costs, for if we get on his wrong side, we could literally end up being buried under his patio and registered as missing people. And I'm not joking about that either. You hear of cases like this every year all around North America. People mysteriously just vanishing without a trace, never to be seen or heard from again. We could be next." "Please don't talk like that, Eartha," I said. "You're scaring me. The man isn't as bad as that, surely." But her foreboding, warning words did send an ominous chill down my spine. I decided to give the local sheriff a call, as I knew him well, and ask him what he knew about the insidious, contentious character, and the news wasn't good. "I didn't want to tell you the bad news, Hamish," the sheriff told me, "but you are living next door to an objectionable, diabolical character, a nasty piece of work that you don't want to associate with in any way, shape or form. Do you know that man even demanded respect from the prison guards when he was incarcerated, and they were always giving him cigarettes and all the other perks to butter him up, as he was so intimidating and feared by everyone."
Tell me something I don't know, I said. The man looks like a fractious thug, and he's easily as hefty as Arnold Schwarzenegger. You've got him in a nutshell, I heard the sheriff saying, pausing on the other end of the phone. For a moment he was silent. Then he said, "What was your impression of him?" "He reminds me of a volatile explosive that could go off at any moment. Quite frankly, he scares me, Sheriff, and I'm feeling uneasy living next door to him. I'm not going to lie to you, Sheriff. It's a little bit like living next door to a volcano that could potentially erupt at any given time, and you're not exactly sure when. I feel as if I have to live with one head permanently looking over my shoulder, always watching my back." "You're not wrong about that, Hamish. He's an unstable individual that has a temper on him that can flare up at any given moment, which was why he had to attend anger management classes while he was inside to convince the judge that he could return to society." "Do you know why he was accused of attempted murder?" I asked. "Do you really want to know?" asked the sheriff. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Hamish. It could cost you a few nights' sleep." "Hell yes, Sheriff. I need to know. Knowledge is power. The more I know, the better." "Very well. It's a long story, really. As you can imagine, Byron is not the type to take rejection lying down, which was why when his girlfriend ended their relationship, she quickly went into hiding. She was terrified by how he would react. I understood she really thought he would kill her. I gather a year after she discovered he was in a relationship with a new woman, she came out of hiding, feeling safe, and started to date his cousin. On her part, that was a very foolish thing to do indeed, because it was like rubbing salt into the wound. Byron reacted incredibly badly and became so enraged and belligerent that his cousin was daring to date his girlfriend, so he willfully attempted to murder his cousin. I think he was still secretly fixated on his ex-girlfriend, and the green-eyed monster reared its ugly head. There's nothing like jealousy to bring down a man, and his was insatiable. He ended up beating his cousin up within an inch of his life, but by some miracle his cousin pulled through, even though he very nearly died. It was touch and go for a moment from what I learnt. Not a pretty situation to be in. I gather his ex-girlfriend was finally killed in a very dodgy accident, where it appeared that her brakes had been tampered with, but nothing was ever proved to link the accident to Byron. But my bet is that he was clearly involved in the incident in some way. So not a nice man, whatever way you look at it." "How absolutely horrifying," I said. "Are you telling me that they've let this monster out of prison? How could they do that?" "I'm afraid it helps having good lawyers fighting your case for you. Byron had the best legal help on his side, thanks to his wealthy, very devoted mother. And in his eyes, her son can do nothing wrong. She's completely blindsided by him, as he treats her like a queen, and in turn she loves him to death." As you can imagine, I was not happy to learn all the gory inside details about my next-door neighbour, and the more I learnt about him, the less I liked him. But little did I realise that I was going to be seeing a great deal more of him, and the relationship between us would be likely to become increasingly hostile and fraught with tension, if I didn't seriously watch my back, that is. It all began when Byron approached me one morning, all guns blazing, whilst I was in the middle of sanding down a cherrywood kitchen cabinet in my workshop. I glanced over my shoulders to see the furious and irate man storming across the yard towards me, and it was a scary sight to behold, for he was a hefty fellow, and by the livid seething expression upon his face, he could have turned a pot of cold oats into a piping hot breakfast cereal. In short, he looked like he intended to beat me up. "You think it's funny?" he thundered towards me, stamping his feet belligerently on the ground, like a petulant spoilt kid. He positioned himself within a foot from where I was standing, and I could feel my hair standing on edge. Sorry, I don't understand what you're talking about," I said. "Don't pretend you don't know. Someone moved a couple of my cars to the far end of my yard and steamrolled the life out of them, and they're so compressed and ravaged they look as flat as pancakes. I've never seen anything like it before."
"I can assure you, Byron," I said, "I didn't do it. How could I move your cars anyway? I haven't got the appropriate machinery to manage such an excavation, and as for pulverizing them in the way that you suggest, I wouldn't perform such a vicious stunt on you. And besides, I don't even have a crushing machine at my disposal. And even if I did, it goes against the grain of my character to do something like this to anybody."
"But you said yourself you find my yard unsightly." "I know of no one else who has the motive to do this," he said. "Those 2 cars are now placed in the far end of the yard, where you can't even see them, which is a distinct advantage for you from a visual perspective." "Not really," I said. "You have hundreds of cars out there. What difference does 2 make to me? But hands on heart, it wasn't me, I can promise you of that."
I was heartily glad to see that Byron had significantly calmed down, and his tight clenched jaw softened, and the tension from his face lifted, and his anger dissipated and subsided as quickly as the steam from a kettle. I think he believed that I had nothing to do with the damage to his clapped-out cars after all, which in itself was a monumental relief. "You didn't happen by any chance to make enemies when you were inside," I suggested, trying to throw the ball away from my court as quickly as I could, hoping to divert his angry energy in another direction. At that, Byron stood very still and scratched his black bandana, as if he was going through a mental note of all the people he'd upset in prison, and by the looks of things he had a sizable collection of disgruntled names to his repertoire.
"You're right," he said. "Someone on the inside with a grudge against me did this to me. And come hell or high water, I'm going to find out who the hell it is. I will invest in some game cameras and surreptitiously hide them around my yard where they can't be seen. And when I find out who did this, they're as good as dead."
"Not literally," I said, eyeing Byron warily.
"I don't speak in riddles," piped Ryan. "You heard what I said. Whoever did this is as good as dead. And when I say dead, I mean a bullet through the temple, quite literally. No one messes with me and gets away with it."
Over the next few weeks, strange, rather peculiar things began to happen on Byron's property, of which there was no explanation. It would seem that someone else besides ourselves and the hundreds of rabbits with burrows on his mountainous inclines were also not happy about the cars and dilapidated agricultural equipment lying precariously around the place at random, cluttering up the countryside, as many of these things had been moved, and their flattened, obliterated metal corpses were lying precariously in one huge heap on top of each other, and it looked as if these cars had been placed through a metal crusher. Who or what had the capacity of doing this, I wondered. It gave me the distinct impression that there was order manifesting amidst this dreadful chaos. My wife and I were secretly rather happy that all this junk was being removed so efficiently, as the side windows of the second story of our home that overlooked Byron's property were no longer looking upon a horrendous eyesore. It would seem that he had no choice but to sell off the badly pulverized cars as scrap metal. Someone had discovered all his trail cameras that he had hidden and thrown them down the hilly embankment, and the only pictures he was able to recover revealed something that looked like a hairy large arm or a squirrel, but we couldn't decide what it was, and a few random pictures of wildlife, such as elk and a lone black bear. But otherwise the guilty party who had performed these clever stunts had managed to avoid being caught on camera. It was on a Tuesday morning when Byron came bounding towards my workshop, and I had never seen the man look so discomposed or rattled before. He reminded me of a lion that you see in a zoo enclosure, pacing up and down restlessly. I had never perceived the man was even capable of being flustered, and he also seemed vulnerable and unusually guarded on this occasion. I watched him playing with his wispy beard awkwardly, and then he piped, "I saw the perpetrator last night. I thought you'd like to know." "Oh, you mean you found the person who's been flattening your cars and throwing them on that huge pile in the back of your yard?"
Yes, that's right.
Well, I said, was it someone you were incarcerated with by any chance? I watched Byron twiddling with his beard uncomfortably, and for a moment he looked a little like a frightened boy. Gone was the male bravado of the dangerous, contentious thug that I was well more acquainted with.
It was Bigfoot, he said. I saw him from my living-room window.
At that I laughed. Bigfoot? Now you are having a joke. This is a joke, am I right?
Do I look like I'm laughing? Said Byron. No, I'm being serious, deadly serious. And you and I need to kill him together. This is our problem.
Why me? I asked. And why is it my problem? What have I got to do with any of this? Why don't you call Fish and Game if you need that kind of help? I am hardly in a position to help you with a Bigfoot. You yourself said that I'm only 170 pounds, and I'm a wimp.
Byron began to growl like a vicious dog, and he grabbed me by the back of my collar and drew my head towards him so that his eyes were glaring directly into mine, and he lowered his voice in a husky tone. You will do as I say, or you'll be sorry. Do you understand, bro? I nodded, trembling in terror. Now I really was afraid. I didn't want to upset this man, but killing a Bigfoot, a creature that I didn't even believe existed, bordered on the insane. But I shut my mouth quickly and nodded. I wasn't about to argue with this man, as it was more than my life was worth. So there I was at midnight at Byron's house, waiting for a visitor of an unusual kind, a creature until now I had dismissed as belonging to the pages of pulp fiction, but now I wasn't so sure. I had seen an insecurity and capriciousness in Byron that I'd never ever discerned before, as he was a rock-solid dude that did not suffer fools gladly. If his feathers had indeed been ruffled by a Bigfoot, I was more inclined to believe him than to doubt him, for this was a man that did not crumble for no reason at all. I had lied to my wife as I had climbed out of the bed in my PJs after checking my watch. It was 1:45 in the morning, the time that I'd agreed to meet Byron at his house. I told her I was investigating a noise in the backyard that I believed I'd heard, and she pulled the sheets over her head and barely acknowledged me, but mumbled something under her breath, so I knew she'd be fast asleep by now. If she had any clue what I was up to tonight, she would be very aggrieved and distressed. I had surreptitiously piled on several layers of clothes in our ensuite bathroom and crept over to Byron's property on a freezing winter's night, where the icy chill literally permeated through my jacket, as the temperatures had dropped quite considerably overnight, and there was an icy wind that was blowing against my face. It certainly wasn't pleasant to be up at this time of the morning. I was wearing a headlamp, which was not a necessity, as the ivory moon was almost full, and the floodlights in Byron's property, which he had left on all night, offered enough illumination to see my way very clearly. Byron handed me a high-powered rifle and asked me if I knew how to use it. I nodded. Good, he said, as he loaded his rifle. When I say go, we will unload our bullets into the critter. Understand? I nodded again, not feeling very confident about anything, and I knew I was not the best of a shot either, but I wasn't eager to allow Byron to know about any of my shortcomings. Byron beckoned for me to follow him, and we surreptitiously crawled behind the heap of flattened cars, which were the most recent victims of the Bigfoot's pliable and crushing hands that had made light work of all this metal. He's coming, whispered Byron. Keep very still. All of a sudden I could hear this very loud rattling sound in his yard, and then the sound of metal being twisted, macerated, mangled and pulverized, rather like the sound you hear when a car crashes into something with brute force, like a tree or something like that. It wasn't long before I could hear hefty footfall walking across the yard. I could sense and feel a very powerful presence moving towards the pile of scrap where we were both hiding behind. I could hear the critter breathing, and he sounded exactly like a horse, and appeared to be grunting in a way that made him sound as if he was a little fed up. By this time Byron was breathing heavily, and his forehead was sweating profusely as the water poured down his face like droplets of rain, and he was shaking as he was holding his rifle in his hand that was literally slipping in his fingers as they were so wet. The man looked utterly petrified, rather reminding me of a rabbit being pursued by a fox, but his focus was still impressive. I was stunned to see a man the size of Arnold Schwarzenegger, the so-called Terminator, reduced to this ridiculous state. I was really too bewildered to react to this enigmatic situation that was unfolding before me. Then I saw him, the dark, shadowy, ghostly silhouette gliding towards us that almost looked demoniacal and was so incongruous to our reality that for a moment I questioned what I was actually perceiving. Never in all my born days have I seen anything so monstrously big. The creature was easily 10 foot tall, 3 feet wide across the shoulder area, and 900 pounds, and was covered with 4-inch long dark hair. The critter had a pyramid-shaped head and a very human face. In its overlong arms he was carrying the remains of a battered car that looked like a squashed-up metal surfboard. I could see the creature rather clearly through the beams of the soft moonlight that dappled the Bigfoot in a shower of radiance. This colossal Bigfoot was standing only yards away from us, and he began to sniff the air, as if he could smell something quite repugnant and very offensive to him, and I realized with horror that he was smelling us. It would seem that he found our body odour to be objectionable and abhorrent. Surely we didn't smell that bad, I thought. I knew Bigfoots are supposed to stink to high heaven, and I wish I could tell you that I smelt the sulphurous, odious compounds they speak about on television programmes when accounting for the presence of a Bigfoot, but all I could smell was a sweet, refreshing, minty scent of pine. "Get ready to fire," whispered Byron, "and let's aim for the head." Byron's words faded as my heart began to pound like a heavy drum, and I became so anxious that my fingers were shaking on the trigger, and my hands became clammy and wet, and I was immobilized with terror. I didn't want to shoot at anything, especially something that looked like a man, covered in hair, only gigantic in his proportions, and there was nothing in this creature's demeanour that made me think it was fair to kill him at all. "Get ready to shoot now," whispered Byron. I could hear Byron unload his bullets at the critter, but it had moved away from the line of fire like greased lightning, and was now standing directly behind Byron, studying him curiously through deep-set dark eyes that in certain lights glittered with a red eyeshine. How could anything have moved so fast, I wondered? This monstrous beast moved towards Byron and curled back his lips and began to growl, displaying an enormous jaw of glistening, oversized human teeth, and the sound he made was the most hostile, aggressive sound that I've ever heard, that would truly make a lion's growl sound like a tame, very friendly pussycat. The Bigfoot lunged boldly towards Byron and pulled the rifle from his hands, twisting it in half and throwing it on the pile of scrap with the rest of the cars. "Kill him!" screamed Byron to me. "Now, you idiot! Get on with it!" I trembled, my wet hand sliding on the trigger, but I was completely unable to shoot. I was too afraid to do anything, but before I could align my thoughts, the creature had grabbed my rifle from me and bent it in half and thrown it on the scrap heap, along with Byron's weapon. Now we were really at the creature's mercy, and I was pretty certain we were as good as dead. "Idiot!" screamed Byron. "Now we're both dead!" The critter grabbed Byron in his overlong arms, throwing him over his shoulders like a huge sack of potatoes, while Byron was cursing, kicking and screaming. I watched the scene unfold before me in horror. It was like watching a movie in slow motion. This was my opportunity to escape. "Move!" my mind shouted to me. "Move! Get out of there now!" But I remained frozen by terror, unable to move even a muscle of mine. What the hell was wrong with me? Why was my body failing to cooperate with my mind? I could see the Bigfoot toss Byron in the air like a huge beach ball, and I heard a loud splash and realised that he'd thrown Byron into the swimming pool. In what seemed like seconds, I was now flung over the creature's gargantuan shoulders like a sack of potatoes, and everything happened so fast as the creature moved at the speed of greased lightning, and I didn't have time even to collect my thoughts or consider what was happening.
All of a sudden I was tossed up into the air at about 10 feet off the ground, and I started to descend into the depths of the water like a heavy rock. I was suddenly submerged in the ice cold, and it was a huge shock to my system. As my head reached the surface, I began oscillating my arms in a desperate, confused panic and taking very sharp, quick breaths. I could see the critter gliding away to the rear of the property towards the wood green, never glancing back at us once. Byron, who'd only just got out of the swimming pool, quickly helped me out of the water, and we both began to tear our clothes off as the icy cold was making us shiver and shake because it was a bitterly cold night. "Come inside," Byron ordered, and I obediently followed him, and the two of us stood naked by the flames of a huge open fire that was crackling away in the living room. We were like two bags of frozen peas defrosting, and were shivering and trembling. Our jaws were chattering. I do not remember a time in my life that I felt more cold. Neither of us said a single word, and Byron fetched a couple of blankets, which we swathed over our bodies, and finally, when we had enough energy, he made us both steaming cups of hot chocolate, and nothing felt so good as the taste of that rich, sweet drink that warmed my entire body. Even after that hot, delicious drink, we both sat there just staring at the flames in a hypnotized state, neither of us saying a single word for possibly a couple of hours, as we were both in a state of suspended shock. "Sorry, bro," said Byron, suddenly breaking the long drawn-out silence that caused me to snap out of my trance. "I shouldn't have dragged you into this. You really were no match for that creature. Did you see the size of the thing?" I nodded, trembling. "He could have killed us both." "You're not wrong about that, bro," said Brian, "but thankfully he didn't harm us. But I see now that I was no match for that thing. Look at the size of me next to him. I felt like a feather. We got off lightly this time, but next time we might not be so lucky." "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Are you going to finally call Fish and Game?" "Fish and Game?" laughed Byron. "Are you for real? If they send someone out, that creature will have their guts for garters. If I can't take him down, no one can." "I see what you mean," I said. "You are very big, but next to him, you did look tiny and inconspicuous, I have to admit." "My point exactly," said Byron. "So what are you going to do?" I asked. "Sell up," said Byron, "and move somewhere safer than this. And you would be wise to do the same." I breathed a huge sigh of relief. If Byron was selling, things were already looking up, I thought privately to myself. I wasn't concerned about the Bigfoot, because if he really wanted us dead, he would have killed us already, and yet he hadn't. To cut a long story short, Byron did sell his property next door, and I'm glad to say that our new neighbours did not litter the land with hundreds of clapped-out old cars like their predecessor had done. For a long time I wondered why the Bigfoot took such offence to Byron's backyard being littered by so many cars, but one day on examining his land, I believe I found the answer. On the far side of his property is a large rugged outcrop, which from a 6-foot elevation appears to open up into a cave. I climbed up there once in a moment of curiosity, and I could see there were long wide passages that led from the cave through the mountain, and I believe they open up somewhere into the wood green. But I was too nervous to go exploring them myself, but it was a hidden access point from the woods to the neighbour's yard, and a perfect shelter from cold weather or rainy conditions. I also noticed very distinguished markers around my neighbour's property, where trees had been deliberately snapped, and long thin branches scantily arranged in very particular ways that gave me the impression that these were Bigfoot signs laying claim to the land. I think the Bigfoot viewed Byron's property that branches out to an extensive area of wood green at its rear as all his territory. The property was very sloped with hilly banks that were like large steps that led up to the flattened area where the house was located, and it was just chock-a-block filled with hundreds of rabbit burrows, which had been blocked off by many of those crumbled cars, which was a potential food source for the Bigfoots, and in some way it was almost like he was managing that warren, like a farmer manages his chickens or cows. So I think this Bigfoot was tidying the place up in order to keep the rabbits all happy, and their burrows easily accessible. Of course, I could be very wrong about this, but that is what I discerned and perceived. One day, 10 years after this extraordinary incident, I happened to stumble into this lean man in the supermarket, and to my amazement it was Byron, and the man was half his original size. I could hardly believe it. I barely recognised him. He was wheeling an old woman in a wheelchair through the store, who wore a happy smile on her wizened face, and was very elegant and well attired, wearing a cashmere sweater and a little necklace of pearls.
"Mother," he said to the woman, "this is my ex-neighbour, Hamish."
"Oh, I heard all about you," she chuckled, "and the problems you had with Bigfoot." I smiled at the woman awkwardly.
"She knows all about our fiasco with the critter," Byron laughed. "I've told Mother absolutely everything about that night when we dried ourselves by the fire naked. Have you happened to see any more of the big creature?"
"No, I can't say I've actually seen anything," I said. "The neighbour who brought your house does tend to find large footsteps from time to time, and gets quite excited about it because he does believe it's Bigfoot. One time he did find a pile of dead rabbits held together with twine that were quickly gone."
"So he's still around then," chuckled Byron. "I'm glad I'm out of there. I'm not going to kid. That thing was a monster."
"If he wanted you dead, son," said the woman, "he would have killed you then and there. But he didn't, so he can't be that bad." "You're right about that," I admitted. "I often think about that. He could so easily have killed us, especially after you shot at him so many rounds. He would have been in his right to do so." "Are you still collecting cars?" I asked Byron.
"Are you kidding?" he laughed. "I've got a full-time job looking after my mother. I haven't got time for that, or the gym. Look at me. I'm half the size that I used to be."
Byron's mother laughed. "And I'm so lucky to have Byron looking after me. I couldn't be in better hands," she said. "I can see that," I said, smiling, as I bid them both farewell, getting into my car and reflecting on the night that I was thrown into the pool by a Bigfoot, something that I will never ever forget in a hurry. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.